Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. The air was crisp, with a salty breeze carrying the rhythmic sound of waves gently lapping at the shore. I often came to this beach to clear my mind, a secluded stretch of sand where the world seemed to stand still. But that day, as I walked along the waterline, something felt off. The sand shifted oddly beneath my feet. At first, I thought it was just the tide pulling grains in and out with each wave, but the movement extended far beyond the reach of the water. Patterns began forming, a swirling dance across the surface of the sand, as if unseen fingers traced symbols and spirals into the earth. Is it the wind? I murmured to myself, though the air was calm. I stopped to watch, my curiosity tinged with unease. The patterns became more intricate, almost hypnotic. My heart skipped a beat when I realized they weren't random. They moved with purpose, creating shapes that seemed to pulse and breathe. I crouched down, brushing my hand lightly across the sand. The grains felt colder than they should have, as if they had been pulled from the depths of the ocean. Then it happened. The sand shifted, not in a lazy swirl, but with intent, wrapping itself around my fingers. I yanked my hand back, heart pounding. A sticky residue clung to my skin, glinting faintly in the fading sunlight. What the? I started, but the words caught in my throat. The sand around my feet began to sink. Panic clawed at my chest. I stepped back, but the ground moved with me, dragging me toward the center of a growing depression. It wasn't quicksand, it was worse. The sand seemed alive, hungry, stretching out like tendrils to pull me closer. I stumbled, landing hard on my hands and knees. The patterns beneath me writhed and shifted, forming something like a face, twisted, ancient, and menacing. A low hum resonated in the air, faint but unmistakable. Help! I shouted, though I knew no one would hear. This part of the beach was isolated, and the nearest town was miles away. I scrambled to my feet, my breath ragged. Every step felt like a fight as the sand clung to my shoes, pulling me back. The ocean, just a few feet away, seemed impossibly distant. Behind me, the depression deepened, the ground folding inward like a great maw. My pulse thundered in my ears as I sprinted toward the water, praying the wet sand near the waves would be solid enough to hold me. The moment I reached the edge of the surf, the pull lessened. I collapsed onto the damp ground, gasping for air. When I looked back, the shifting patterns had stilled, and the sand lay undisturbed, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. Something was wrong with this beach. Something was alive beneath the surface, waiting, watching. And it wasn't finished with me. I didn't go back to the beach the next day, or the day after that. But the memory haunted me, the cold grip of the sand, the way it moved with intent. No matter how hard I tried to rationalize it, the experience didn't make sense. By the third night, my dreams were filled with images of swirling patterns, vast dunes that seemed to breathe, and a voice calling my name, muffled and distant, like it was speaking through layers of earth. When I woke, drenched in sweat, I knew I had to return. Not because I wanted to, but because some part of me was compelled to. The beach looked different that evening. The tide had receded further than I'd ever seen, leaving behind a vast expanse of damp, compact sand. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting long shadows that danced across the empty shore. I walked cautiously, my eyes scanning every inch of the ground. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The sand felt firm beneath my feet, the air quiet except for the faint roar of distant waves. Then I saw it. Etched into the sand were the same spirals and symbols I had seen before, but this time they were larger, more complex. They stretched out in an intricate pattern that spanned yards, like the work of a master artist with an otherworldly hand. I approached slowly, my pulse quickening with every step. The symbols seemed to shift as I moved closer, their edges blurring and twisting, as if refusing to be fully understood. I crouched down, running my fingers over one of the spirals. It felt smoother than the surrounding sand, almost polished, like stone. A sudden chill shot up my arm, and I jerked my hand back. "You came back." The voice startled me. It wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that made my chest tighten. I spun around, expecting to see someone standing behind me, but the beach was empty. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. The symbols pulsed faintly, a soft glow emanating from their edges. The patterns began to move again, shifting into new forms. This time, they spelled out words. "Stay." I stumbled backward, my heart racing. The ground beneath me rippled, like the surface of a pond disturbed by a stone. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "This isn't real." But it was. The sand around my feet began to sink again, pulling me down with relentless force. I struggled, clawing at the ground, but the more I fought, the stronger the pull became. "Why are you doing this?" I shouted, though I wasn't sure who or what I was speaking to. The sand didn't answer. It simply dragged me closer to the center of the patterns, where the glow intensified. The spirals and symbols twisted and coiled, forming a vortex that seemed to stretch into infinity. I reached out desperately, my fingers scraping against something hard beneath the surface. It felt like stone, cold, smooth, and unyielding. I gripped it tightly, using it as leverage to pull myself free. With one final, desperate effort, I broke free from the sand's grasp and scrambled away, panting and shaking. The glowing patterns dimmed, fading into the earth as quickly as they had appeared. I didn't stop running until I reached the edge of the beach, where the dunes met the safety of solid ground. My legs trembled, my body drenched in sweat, but I couldn't bring myself to look back. Whatever was happening on that beach wasn't over. It had let me go, for now. But I knew I couldn't escape it forever. The next morning, I woke to an ache in my chest that felt heavier than exhaustion. Every muscle protested as I moved, but the worst pain was in my head. A dull, pulsing throb matched the rhythm of my heartbeat, as though the beach had left a piece of itself lodged in my skull. I tried to avoid thinking about what had happened, but the marks on my arms told a different story. Tiny scratches lined my skin where the sand had gripped me, and faint grains still clung to the wounds, glittering like fragments of glass. That day, I avoided the shore. I stayed indoors, pacing the small rental cabin, trying to convince myself that I was safe. But the quiet only made things worse. The sound of the ocean seemed louder than it should have been, the waves crashing in my ears even though the water was miles away. And then I heard it. A faint hum, low and resonant, coming from beneath the floorboards. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, a trick of my overactive mind. But the sound grew louder, shifting into a faint, rhythmic whisper. It was the same tone I'd heard on the beach. I backed away from this sound, but it seemed to follow me, echoing through the cabin like a living thing. My hands trembled as I grabbed my coat and stumbled out the door, desperate for fresh air, for distance. But outside wasn't any better. The ground beneath the cabin seemed to tremble, the vibration faint but unmistakable. The sand in the distance shimmered in the midday sun, too bright, too still. I knew I couldn't stay here. I got in my car and drove, my hands gripping the wood tightly as I headed inland. The further I went, the quieter the hum became, until it was gone altogether. I pulled into the parking lot of a roadside diner, my heart still pounding. Inside, the place smelled of coffee and grease. The waitress gave me a strange look as I slid into a booth, probably because I looked as though I'd seen a ghost. "Coffee?" she asked, her voice flat and uninterested. "Please," I croaked. As she walked away, I stared out the window, trying to make sense of everything. What was happening to me? Was I losing my mind? A soft knock on the table broke my thoughts. I turned to see an older man sitting across from me, his weathered face lined with years of sun and salt. He wasn't there a moment ago, and yet he sat as if he belonged. "You've seen it, haven't you?" he said, his voice low and steady. I stared at him, unsure how to respond. "Seen what?" "The sand," he said simply, his eyes locking onto mine. "The moving patterns. The pull." I swallowed hard. "How do you know about that?" He leaned back, his gaze never wavering. "Because I've seen it too. Years ago, on this very stretch of coast. It took my brother." My blood ran cold. "I thought I was the only one," I whispered. The man shook his head slowly. "No, you're not. And if you're smart, you'll leave now. The longer you stay, the stronger it gets." "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely audible. He hesitated, his face shadowed with an expression I couldn't quite read. "It's older than us. Older than the ocean. The locals used to call it the hunger beneath. It takes what it wants, and it never lets go." "Why me?" I asked. "Why now?" "I don't know," he admitted. "But if it's marked you, it won't stop. You can run, but it'll find you. It always does." The waitress returned with my coffee, and when I turned back to the man, he was gone. That night, I dreamed of the beach again. The symbols glowed brighter than ever, and the sand whispered my name. It was waiting. The dream didn't let go when I woke. It clung to me like a fog that blurred the line between memory and nightmare. The old man's words echoed in my mind, warning me of something I couldn't escape. I should have left. Every instinct told me to pack my things and drive inland until the sound of waves was nothing but a memory. But instead, I found myself walking toward the beach at sunset, drawn by some invisible thread I couldn't sever. The air was eerily still when I arrived, as though the world was holding its breath. The tide had pulled back even further, exposing a vast expanse of wet sand that shimmered like glass under the fading light. At first, everything was quiet. The patterns from before were gone, and the beach looked almost normal. Almost. I stepped cautiously onto the sand, my shoes sinking slightly into the damp surface. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the earth itself resisted my presence. "Why am I here?" I whispered, my voice lost in the emptiness. The answer came in the form of movement. The sand began to ripple, subtle at first, then more pronounced. Patterns emerged once again, spirals and lines that stretched out in every direction. But this time, they didn't stay on the ground. The sand rose, forming columns and arches that twisted into unnatural shapes. It was as if the beach was alive, reshaping itself into something ancient and incomprehensible. I backed away, but the ground beneath me shifted, dragging me closer to the growing structures. The symbols glowed faintly, pulsating like a heartbeat, and a deep, resonant hum filled the air. I fell to my knees, clutching my head as the sound grew louder, vibrating through my very bones. The sand moved faster now, coiling and twisting around me like living snakes. "You can't have me," I shouted, my voice breaking. The hum stopped. For a moment, the beach was silent. Then, a voice, soft, deep, and ancient, whispered through the air. "You came to us. You belong to us." The sand surged upward, wrapping around my legs and pulling me down. I screamed, clawing at the ground, but it was no use. The more I struggled, the deeper I sank. I closed my eyes, bracing for the end. But instead of suffocating darkness, I felt a sudden, jarring stillness. When I opened my eyes, I was no longer on the beach. I stood in a vast expanse of white sand, stretching endlessly in every direction. The sky was dark, filled with swirling stars that moved unnaturally fast. The symbols from the beach were etched into the ground beneath me, glowing with an intensity that hurt my eyes. In the distance, a massive figure began to rise from the sand. It was formless at first, a shifting mass of grains and light, but as it moved closer, it took on a humanoid shape, towering, ancient, and terrible. Its eyes were voids, endless and consuming. "You woke us," it said, its voice reverberating through the air. "And now, you will feed us." I stumbled backward, my heart pounding. "What are you?" It tilted its head, as if amused by my question. "We are what was here before the water, before the earth, before you, and we will remain when all else is gone." The sand beneath me began to shift again, pulling me toward the figure. I fought against it, but the force was stronger than anything I'd ever felt. "Please," I begged, tears streaming down my face. "Let me go." The figure paused, its void-like eyes narrowing. "You carry our mark. You cannot escape." Suddenly, a sharp pain shot through my chest. I looked down to see a glowing symbol etched into my skin, the same spirals and lines from the beach. I screamed, the pain unbearable, as the sand swallowed me whole. When I woke, I was back in my cabin, gasping for air. My clothes were soaked with sweat, and my chest ached as though something had been burned into my skin. I pulled my shirt aside and froze. The symbol was there, faint but unmistakable, glowing softly in the dark. It wasn't a dream. It would never be a dream again. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind against the windows felt like the hum of the sand, calling me back. The glowing mark on my chest pulsed faintly, a constant reminder that I was no longer my own. The old man's words rang in my head, "It won't stop. It always finds you." By dawn, I had made up my mind. If I stayed, it would come for me. If I ran, it would follow. There was no escaping it. The only choice left was to face it and hope, somehow, I could survive. The beach was empty when I arrived. The tide had receded even further, revealing stretches of sand that looked untouched by human footsteps. The air was heavier than before, thick with the smell of salt and something else, something ancient and metallic. As I stepped onto the beach, the mark on my chest burned, as though it were reacting to the presence of the sand. The ground shifted beneath my feet almost immediately, the patterns returning with a vengeance. This time, I didn't run. "What do you want from me?" I shouted, my voice cutting through the unnatural stillness. The sand responded in an instant. The patterns swirled and twisted, rising into towering shapes that loomed over me. The humming returned, louder and deeper, vibrating through the air like the growl of a hungry predator. The voice followed, soft yet deafening in its weight. "You are ours." I clenched my fists, the fear threatening to swallow me whole. I didn't ask for this. I didn't want this. The sand coiled around my legs, dragging me toward the center of the shifting patterns. I struggled, but the pull was relentless. As I was drawn closer, the glowing symbols on the ground began to align, forming a massive spiral that pulsed with an otherworldly light. At the center of the spiral, the figure rose again. Its formless body of sand and light towered over me, its void-like eyes staring into my very soul. "You woke us. You brought us back." I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. "I didn't do anything." The figure reached out, a massive hand of swirling sand hovering inches from my chest. The mark burned brighter, its glow blinding. "The mark is a door," the voice said. "You are the key. Through you, we return." I screamed as the pain in my chest intensified. The spiral beneath me began to sink, forming a vortex that threatened to swallow me whole. The air crackled with energy, the hum growing louder until it drowned out my thoughts. In a final, desperate act, I reached into the sand, grabbing a jagged rock. With every ounce of strength I had left, I slashed it across the glowing mark on my chest. The reaction was immediate. A deafening roar erupted from the figure as the light from the mark dimmed, flickering like a dying flame. The vortex slowed, its pull weakening. The towering foam of sand and light began to collapse, its edges crumbling into grains that were swept away by an unseen wind. The ground beneath me steadied, the patterns fading into the earth. The hum ceased, leaving only the sound of the waves crashing against the shore. I fell to my knees, gasping for air. The mark on my chest was gone, replaced by a jagged scar that throbbed dully. For the first time in days, the beach was silent. I never returned to that place. The nightmares lingered, the echoes of what I'd seen and heard haunting me in the quiet moments. I told no one, not because they wouldn't believe me, but because I didn't want to believe it myself. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still hear the hum. And I wonder if it's truly over, or if the hunger beneath is merely waiting for another door to open. Have you ever noticed time slip away faster than it should? That's how it started for me. It was a Monday morning when I first realized something was wrong. My alarm didn't go off. I woke up to sunlight streaming through the blinds, my phone showing 8:45. I was already late. I glanced at the clock on my bedside table, but it was frozen at 3:15. The second hand twitched, like it wanted to move but couldn't. Frustrated, I tapped it, shook it, even changed the battery, but nothing worked. That was just the beginning. By the time I got to the kitchen, the wall clock above the sink was still 6:27. That couldn't be right. The sun was high in the sky. I checked the microwave, blank screen. Even the old pocket watch my grandfather left me, which had never once stopped, was lifeless. Every clock in the house was frozen, stuck in its own time. I shrugged it off at first. Maybe it was some weird electrical issue. Maybe I'd accidentally magnetized something, or maybe I just needed to replace some batteries. But the unease crept in anyway, like a shadow stretching across the edges of my thoughts. That night, the real strangeness began. I sat in the living room, flipping through channels on the TV, but nothing held my attention. The shows blurred together, and the minutes seemed to stretch endlessly. I glanced at my phone, expecting it to be 10 o'clock at the latest. It was 1 in the morning. Somehow, I had lost 3 hours without noticing. My chest tightened, the first prick of genuine fear crawling up my spine. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the feeling. But then, I heard it, a faint ticking sound. I froze, my eyes darting to the empty wall where the old cuckoo clock used to hang. It hadn't worked in years, and I'd thrown it out months ago. The sound grew louder, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from every corner of the house. I followed the noise to the hallway, where the faint glow of moonlight cast long shadows on the floor. The ticking grew sharper, faster, until it felt like it was inside my head. And then it stopped. The silence was so abrupt, it was deafening. When I turned back to the living room, the pocket watch was gone. It had been sitting on the coffee table minutes earlier, but now there was only an empty spot where it should have been. My stomach churned. I checked every corner of the room, searching for some rational explanation, but the watch was nowhere to be found. As I stood there, trying to calm my racing heart, a sudden realization hit me. The clocks weren't just frozen. They were disappearing. The next morning, I searched the entire house. The bedside clock, the wall clock, even the broken microwave display, gone. No trace of them remained. I tried to tell myself it didn't matter. Clocks could be replaced. But the unease had grown into something darker, a gnawing sense that time itself was slipping away. That evening, I went to bed early, desperate for some semblance of normalcy. But sleep didn't come easily. The air felt heavy, thick with a tension I couldn't explain. At some point, I drifted off. And when I woke, the night hadn't ended. The clock on my phone read 3:13, the same time it had been when I last looked. The world outside was pitch black, the kind of darkness that shouldn't exist in a city with streetlights. I waited, staring at the glowing numbers on my phone, but they never changed. The night stretched on, endless and suffocating. By the time I finally got out of bed, the house felt wrong. The walls seemed closer than before, the shadows sharper. Every sound was amplified, the creak of the floorboards, the soft hum of the fridge. But beyond that, there was something else. A faint, hollow echo, like the sound of distant footsteps. I wasn't alone. The footsteps were faint at first, barely distinguishable from the creaks and groans of the old house. But they grew louder, more deliberate, like someone pacing just beyond the edge of my vision. I grabbed my phone, its screen still frozen at 3:13, and used its dim light to guide me. My breath came shallow, each step forward tightening the knot in my chest. "Hello?" My voice sounded weak, swallowed by the oppressive silence. No answer. The footsteps stopped. I scanned the hallway, my phone casting long, jagged shadows on the walls. Everything was still, unnervingly so. Then I noticed something that made my stomach drop, the faint outline of a clock on the wall, a shadow where the kitchen clock used to hang. It was as if the clock had been erased, leaving only its memory behind. I turned away, only to find the same thing in the living room. The old cuckoo clock spot was now a faint discoloration, an imprint left behind like a scar. Every missing clock had a shadow, a reminder of where it once existed. My mind raced, grasping for explanations. Sleep deprivation? A cruel prank? But deep down, I knew none of this was normal. Time itself was breaking. The hours, or what I assumed were hours, dragged on without any change. The night refused to give way to dawn, and the house seemed to shift around me. The walls felt narrower, the ceiling lower. I tried everything to track time, counting seconds, pacing the length of the hallway, even listening to the faint rhythm of my heartbeat. But it was useless. Without clocks, time became meaningless. The footsteps returned. This time, they were faster, moving erratically. They circled me, coming closer and closer until I spun around, desperate to catch whoever, or whatever, was there. But there was nothing. Only shadows. And then, the whispering began. It was faint at first, a soft murmuring that seemed to seep through the walls. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, urgent, frantic, like a warning. I followed the sound to the bedroom, my heart pounding. The whispers grew louder, clearer, until I could hear fragments of words. Dawn, time, yours now. As I stepped into the room, my phone flickered and died, plunging me into complete darkness. For a long moment, I stood there, paralyzed by fear. My eyes adjusted slowly, picking out vague shapes in the gloom. The bed, the dresser, the empty wall where another clock had disappeared. The whispering stopped. A lull hum filled the air, growing louder with every passing second. It wasn't a sound I could describe. It wasn't mechanical or natural. It was wrong. The hum seemed to vibrate through the floor, shaking the walls and rattling the windows. I stumbled backward, gripping the doorframe for support, and that's when I saw it. In the corner of the room, where the shadows were deepest, something moved. It was barely visible, a distortion in the air, like heat waves rising from asphalt. But it had shape, a tall, thin figure with elongated limbs that seemed to ripple and shift. It stepped forward, and the shadows stretched with it, wrapping around the room like tendrils. "No," I whispered, backing away. The figure tilted its head, as if studying me. Then it reached out with one impossibly long arm, its hand, or what I assumed was a hand, pointing directly at me. The hum intensified, the vibrations now so strong that I thought the house might collapse. And then, the figure spoke. "Time belongs to us." The words echoed in my mind rather than my ears, and with them came a sharp, searing pain in my chest. I collapsed to the floor, clutching at the spot where the ache radiated. When I opened my eyes, the figure was gone, but so was the shadow of the clock on the wall. I don't know how long I lay there. Time had lost all meaning. The house was silent again, the oppressive hum gone, but the air felt different. Thinner. When I finally managed to stand, I noticed something strange. The room seemed older. The wallpaper was peeling, the furniture faded and worn. It was as though decades had passed in an instant. And on the floor, where the shadow of the clock had been, was a small, smooth object. A shard of glass. I picked it up, turning it over in my hand. It was cold to the touch, unnaturally so, and as I stared into its surface, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The faint reflection of a figure watching me from the darkness. The shard of glass felt heavier the longer I held it, as if it was anchoring me to the spot. My fingers trembled as I turned it over, the faint reflection of the figure shifting in the dim light. It wasn't standing still anymore. The figure moved, gliding closer within the reflection, though I saw nothing when I looked around the room. It was as if the shard held a window into a different reality, one where the figure existed and watched me. I dropped it. The glass hit the floor with a sharp clink and spun in a lazy circle before settling. The reflection was gone, but the room had changed again. The air was colder, the walls darker. The furniture had warped, edges curling like old parchment. Time wasn't just slipping anymore, it was unspooling, the boundaries between moments fraying at the edges. I wanted to leave, to run out of the house and never look back, but my legs felt rooted in place. Something was holding me there, an invisible force that tugged at the edges of my thoughts. The whispers returned. They were louder this time, coming from every direction. Words overlapped, spilling into one another in a chaotic symphony. No escape, time undone, the end. I covered my ears, but it didn't help. The whispers weren't just in the room, they were inside me. I stumbled out of the bedroom, down the hall, and into the living room. The floorboards creaked underfoot, their groans echoing like cries in the dark. And then I saw it. The pocket watch. It sat on the coffee table, exactly where it had been before it disappeared. Its surface gleamed in the faint light, the hands spinning wildly, faster than any clock should move. I didn't want to touch it, but I couldn't look away. My hand moved on its own, reaching out as if compelled by some unseen force. The moment my fingers brushed the cold metal, the world shifted. I was no longer in my house. The walls around me melted into shadows, the floor dissolving beneath my feet. I found myself standing in a vast, endless void, the air thick with the same oppressive hum that had filled my home. The only source of light came from the pocket watch in my hand, its frantic hands casting faint golden rays into the darkness. Then, the figure appeared. It rose from the shadows, towering over me, its limbs stretching into impossible shapes. The distorted hum grew louder, and I realized it wasn't just a sound, it was a voice. Time is broken. The words reverberated through the void, each syllable striking me like a physical blow. I clutched the pocket watch tighter, its warmth seeping into my skin. What do you want from me? The figure leaned closer, its face, or lack of one, mere inches from mine. You are the anchor. The last thread. I didn't understand. None of it made sense, but the weight of its words pressed down on me, suffocating. The figure's elongated hand reached out, pointing at the watch in my hand. The hum shifted, now a chorus of voices chanting in unison. Let go. I shook my head, chanting grew louder, the void around me pulsating with every word. The hands of the watch spun faster, blurring into a golden whirl. The warmth in my hand turned to searing heat, and I cried out, dropping the watch. The moment it left my hand, everything stopped. The hum, the chanting, the figure. I was alone in the void, floating in silence. But the silence didn't last. A deep, resonant chime echoed through the darkness, and I realized it was coming from the watch, now suspended in midair. Each chime sent ripples through the void, the shadows around me recoiling like living things. The figure returned, its form even more distorted, like a broken mirror struggling to hold itself together. You let it go. The voice wasn't angry. It was sat in then, with a final, deafening chime, the pocket watch shattered, its pieces scattering into the void. I woke up on the floor of my living room, gasping for air. The house was silent again, the oppressive hum gone. But everything felt wrong. The shadows were deeper, the air thicker. The marks where the clocks had been were no longer faint outlines, they were black, charred scars on the walls. And when I looked at my reflection in the window, I didn't recognize the person staring back. I stared at the reflection in the window, my breath catching in my throat. It was me, but it wasn't. The face was pale, thinner, the skin stretched tight across unfamiliar cheekbones. Dark circles framed hollow eyes, and the expression in them was something I didn't recognize. Fear? Anger? Despair? I reached up to touch my face, and the reflection mimicked me. But the movement was delayed, like it was struggling to keep up. The whispers returned. This time, they were closer, clearer, as if someone was speaking directly into my ear. Time slips. Time shatters. I stumbled back from the window, my heart pounding. The room around me seemed to bend and twist, the walls rippling like water. The air was heavier now, pressing against my chest. I needed to get out of the house. I grabbed my coat from the chair by the door, but when I turned the knob, it wouldn't budge. The door felt fused to the frame, as if it had become a part of the wall. Panic surged through me. I ran to the windows, but they wouldn't open either. The glass was cold to the touch, unnaturally so, and when I pressed against it, the surface rippled like liquid. I was trapped. The whispers grew louder, overlapping until they formed a cacophony that filled every corner of the house. All time ends, all time begins. I covered my ears, but it didn't help. The sound wasn't just external, it was inside my head, resonating in my skull. And then, the whispers stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. Then came the ticking. It started faint, a single, deliberate click that echoed through the house. Another followed, then another, growing faster, louder, until it felt like the walls themselves were alive with the sound. I turned to see the shadows moving again, creeping along the walls like ink spilled into water. They gathered in the center of the room, coalescing into a shape I recognized all too well. The figure was back, but it was different this time. It was no longer a vague distortion. Now, it was solid, tangible, and impossibly tall. Its elongated limbs ended in sharp points, and its featureless face seemed to tilt in amusement or malice. In its hand, it held the pocket watch, fully intact. The sight of it filled me with a mix of dread and rage. "What do you want from me?" I shouted. The figure didn't speak. Instead, it extended the watch toward me, the ticking now deafening. I didn't want to take it, but my body moved on its own. My hand reached out, trembling, and the moment my fingers brushed the cold metal, the world around me shattered. I was no longer in the house. I stood in a vast, open field under a sky that defied description. It wasn't day or night, light and darkness swirled together in a chaotic dance, casting strange, shifting shadows on the ground. The air was thick and still, and the only sound was the relentless ticking of the watch in my hand. Ahead of me, the figure waited. Its presence was overwhelming, filling the space with a weight I couldn't describe. It raised one long, pointed arm and gestured to the sky. I followed its gaze and felt my stomach drop. The sky was breaking apart. Fragments of light and shadow peeled away, revealing a swirling void beyond. Time itself seemed to unravel, the past and future collapsing into one another in a chaotic spiral. The figure turned to me, and for the first time, I heard its voice clearly. "You must choose." "Choose what?" I asked, my voice trembling. It gestured to the pocket watch in my hand. The hands were spinning wildly, faster than ever before, the ticking now almost a roar. "Time is broken. Restore it, or let it end." The weight of its words hit me like a blow. "Ow! I don't know how to fix this." The figure leaned closer, its form distorting, warping, as if it were being pulled apart by the same forces tearing the sky. "You are the last thread. The watch grew heavier in my hand, its heat searing into my palm. The ticking slowed, each click reverberating through my entire body. I looked at the figure, at the sky, at the watch. And then I made my choice. I closed my eyes, gripping the pocket watch with all my strength. The weight of it was unbearable, a force pulling at the very core of my being. The ticking had become a constant throb in my chest, a rhythmic pulse that drowned out everything else. The figure's presence loomed over me, its distorted form a terrifying shadow against the swirling chaos of the sky. "You have chosen," it intoned, its voice like 1,000 whispers woven into one. I didn't know if I had chosen right or wrong, but I knew that I had no other choice. With a shaking hand, I raised the watch toward the void, where time had shattered and split into 1,000 fragments. The ticking grew louder, the sound deafening, until it was all I could hear. The world around me began to warp and twist, the sky folding in on itself. I whispered, barely able to hear my own voice. "Please, make it stop." And then, in a blinding flash, everything went silent. When I opened my eyes, I was back in my house. It was normal. The walls were intact, the furniture undisturbed. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, its hands moving as they should. The windows were clear, letting in the soft light. I looked around, trying to steady my breath. The air felt thin, like something was missing. The house was empty, devoid of the noise that had filled it just moments before. I walked through each room, searching for something, anything, that would tell me I had truly returned. I reached the living room and saw the pocket watch lying on the coffee table, just as it had before. But now it was still, its hands frozen at a single moment in time. I reached out to touch it, and as soon as my fingers brushed the cool metal, a chill ran through me. The reflection in the glass caught my eye, but it wasn't my own face I saw. It was the figure. The same tall, distorted form, its elongated limbs twitching as if it were reaching out to me. I pulled my hand away in panic, but the figure's reflection remained, hovering in the glass. And then, it spoke. Time is never truly fixed. It only waits. I staggered back, my heart pounding in my chest. The house around me felt smaller, the walls pressing in, the air suffocating. Time had been broken, and I had tried to mend it. But now, I realized it wasn't something that could be repaired. Not completely. The figure's voice echoed in my mind as I stood in the quiet of the living room. There is always a price. I turned away from the reflection, my head spinning. I wanted to leave, to escape from this house and never look back. But as I reached for the door, I felt something cold, like the breath of something ancient, whisper against my ear. I stopped, staring at the door, knowing that if I opened it, I might step into another broken moment, another piece of time that would never be whole again. And I wondered, what had I truly saved? Or had I only delayed the inevitable? Time was waiting. The watch still ticked. It started with a simple question: how do you know something is real? I had never thought about it before, at least not in the way I did after the first letter arrived. I remember it clearly. I had come home from a long day at work, tired and frustrated, ready to collapse into my couch. The mail was scattered on the small table by the door, the usual mix of bills and junk. But there, at the top of the pile, was a single envelope, no return address, just my name written in thick, slanted handwriting. The paper felt strange, not the glossy, commercial type you usually get in the mail. This was rough, almost textured, like it had been made by hand. I turned it over, hesitated for a moment, and then ripped it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded neatly in half. I read the words, my heart racing with each line. You are being watched. Don't trust what you see. They are closer than you think. It wasn't signed. At first, I thought it was a joke. Maybe some kind of prank. But something about the neatness of the handwriting, the way the words were carefully spaced, made me uneasy. It felt too deliberate. Too real. I tossed the letter aside, telling myself it was just a mistake, something I'd overreacted to. But that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The next day, the second letter arrived. I found it waiting for me when I came home again, sitting in the same spot as the first, like it had always been there. The handwriting was the same. You don't remember, do you? You've been here before. This is not your first warning. I couldn't breathe. The words seemed to rattle in my chest, vibrating with an intensity one couldn't explain. The paper in my hands felt too heavy, like it was crushing me, and for a moment, I wondered if I might drop it altogether. I didn't know what to make of it. Had I written these letters to myself? No, that was impossible. I couldn't remember doing that. Could I have been sleepwalking, writing them in a daze? But the neatness of the letters, how perfectly each word was written, made that theory hard to believe. I ran my fingers over the paper, the rough texture reminding me of something. Something I couldn't quite grasp. I stood still in my living room, feeling the air around me shift. I wasn't alone. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the sound of my heartbeat in my ears. As the days passed, the letters continued to come. Always in the same spot. Always in the same handwriting. Always with cryptic warnings. I tried to burn them. I tried to throw them away. But each time, a new letter appeared, each more urgent than the last. They are already here. You cannot outrun them. They know everything about you. You are not who you think you are. The past is not what you remember. The last letter I received was the most chilling of all. If you want to escape, you must stop them. Before they stop you. Who was I supposed to stop? What was I supposed to do? The walls of my apartment felt like they were closing in, and the air seemed thicker every time I tried to breathe. The room grew darker, even though it was only mid-afternoon. And outside my window, shadows seemed to shift, moving as if something, or someone, was watching me. I could feel their eyes on me, following my every movement. But no matter how many times I checked the locks or peered out the window, I couldn't see anyone. I couldn't find anyone. I couldn't take it anymore. The letters had worn me down to my breaking point. The fear was taking over, and I didn't know what was real anymore. I decided to leave. To run. But as I grabbed my keys and stepped out the door, I froze. The hallway was empty, just like every other time, but something was different. The air felt colder, and there was a faint sound echoing through the hall. The faintest of whispers. I turned around quickly, but there was no one there. The hallway stretched on, as it always had. The lights flickered overhead, casting eerie shadows against the walls. I swallowed hard, feeling a wave of nausea sweep over me. Then, I noticed something strange. The floor was covered in a dusting of paper. I bent down to pick it up, my heart racing, and immediately recognized the handwriting. I looked at the small sheet of paper in my hands, the words starting to blur before my eyes. You're not supposed to leave. It's already too late. And then I understood. The letters were warnings. They were a message. A message from me. But how? I had been here before. This had all happened before. I'd already received the letters. I'd already tried to leave. I realized in that moment that the danger wasn't just outside my apartment. It was inside me. And if I didn't stop what had started, if I didn't find a way to break this loop, it would consume me. I had to find the source. I had to stop the letters from coming. But how? That was the only question that mattered now. I couldn't stay in the hallway any longer. The whispering had become louder, more insistent, as if the walls themselves were pressing against me, urging me to listen. I stepped back into my apartment and slammed the door shut, my hand shaking as I leaned against it. The papers. The letters. They felt like they were a part of me now, every word etched into my mind, repeating over and over. You're not supposed to leave. It's already too late. I tried to steady my breathing, but the weight of the words pressed down on me, suffocating me. I dropped to the floor, clutching the letter in my hand. I was trapped. The apartment, once so familiar, now felt alien, cold. The shadows in the corners seemed to grow longer, stretching out like fingers reaching toward me. The silence was unbearable, broken only by the faintest rustle of paper. I looked down at the scattered pieces of paper on the floor, the edges curled and yellowed with age. How had they appeared here? I didn't remember dropping them. I didn't remember writing them. It's already too late. The words kept echoing in my head, looping like a broken record. I had to leave, but where could I go? Every step I took only seemed to lead me back to this place. I stood up slowly, feeling dizzy, and glanced around. My apartment had always been small, but now it felt even smaller, like the walls were closing in, trapping me in some kind of suffocating loop. I stumbled toward the window, the one place that had always offered some sense of freedom. But when I reached it, I froze. The street outside was empty. No cars, no people. Just an eerie stillness. But that wasn't what made my blood run cold. It was the reflection in the glass. I couldn't see myself. Instead, I saw a figure standing in the corner of the room. It was a shadow at first, but as I stared, the shape became clearer. A tall figure, draped in darkness, standing motionless in the farthest corner of my apartment. My heart raced. I spun around, but the corner was empty. I turned back to the window, and there it was again. The figure, now closer, its presence more defined. It was watching me. You can't escape. The words seemed to come from the figure itself, but it hadn't moved its lips. No sound had come from its mouth. My breath caught in my throat. I backed away from the window, my body trembling, my mind racing. The figure had been there. I knew it. But when I turned around, there was nothing. I needed to leave. I had to get out of here, out of this place, but my legs wouldn't move. I looked at the door. I could hear the sound of the letters rustling, their whispers becoming louder. But I couldn't bring myself to touch them. I couldn't trust them. I felt like I was being pulled in two directions, one telling me to stay, the other telling me to run. But both felt wrong. It's already too late. The words came again, like a distant chant, vibrating through my chest. I reached for my phone, hoping to find some kind of escape, some kind of proof that this wasn't real. But when I unlocked it, I froze. There, on the screen, was the same message. You are not alone. They are already here. I dropped the phone, my hand shaking uncontrollably. The air around me seemed to warp, the space itself beginning to bend. I couldn't tell if the room was growing larger or smaller. The edges of the walls seemed to blur, as if they were dissolving into the air. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to leave. There was no choice anymore. But then the lights flickered, and the whispering began again. It was coming from the letters. They were shifting, moving. I couldn't see it clearly, but I could feel it. The room was changing, twisting. The shadows in the corners were no longer just shadows, they were becoming something else. I stepped forward, my feet feeling heavy, as though the ground beneath me was shifting. The door seemed to move further away, just out of reach. The whispers grew louder, more frantic. I looked at the letters, scattered on the floor, their edges now curling and twisting like living things. I couldn't make sense of it anymore. Nothing was making sense. You cannot escape. The words weren't coming from the paper anymore. They were coming from inside my own head. I turned around, desperate to find something, anything, that could explain what was happening. And that's when I saw it. The figure, standing right in front of me. It was tall and thin, its features hidden in the darkness. But I could feel its presence, feel its eyes on me, watching. You should have listened. It didn't move, but I could feel its presence press against me. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was paralyzed, caught in the gaze of something that wasn't quite human. You were warned. The figure's voice echoed in my head. And then I understood. The letters weren't just warnings. They were a part of something much bigger. Something that had been waiting for me to make a choice. And now, there was no turning back. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, like it was trying to break free. I stood frozen, my eyes locked on the figure before me. It had no face, no details that I could truly define, but its presence filled the room, suffocating me. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, but my body refused to obey. My legs were stiff, rooted to the spot as if the floor had become part of me. The figure didn't move. It didn't need to. Its mere existence was enough to send waves of terror crashing through my mind. You should have listened. The voice rang out, louder this time, but not from its mouth. It was inside my head, like it was part of me, like I was hearing my own thoughts, but they weren't mine. I couldn't escape it. I couldn't escape this thing, it. I wanted to speak, but my throat felt dry, like sandpaper. My breath was shallow, but I managed to whisper, "What do you want from me?" There was no response. The silence that followed felt heavier than the oppressive air that clung to the room. Then, the figure began to move, its shape shifting slightly, distorting in ways I couldn't fully comprehend. The darkness around it swirled like smoke, wrapping itself around the corners of the room, making everything feel wrong. I shut my eyes tightly, trying to block out the sight, the growing presence that threatened to swallow me whole. But the whispering was still there, louder now, urging me to listen, to understand. The letters. The warnings. Everything was connected. Suddenly, I felt a tug at my wrist. My eyes snapped open. The letters, those damn letters, were rising from the floor. They seemed to be pulled by an invisible force, each one floating toward me like it had its own mind. The edges of the paper glowed faintly, almost like they were alive. No, this wasn't happening. I staggered back, my mind struggling to process the chaos around me. It's already too late. The words echoed again, only this time, they weren't just in my head. They were coming from everywhere, swarming around me like a storm, a torrent of voices speaking at once. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it did nothing. The voices got louder, more insistent. You can't run. You can't hide. You already wrote the end. My stomach twisted. My body burned with the terror of it all. But even as I tried to deny it, the words made sense. The letters. The warnings. The things I couldn't remember writing. I had been warned. I had been warned. There had been no escape from the moment the first letter arrived, no escaping whatever had chosen me, no escaping the fact that this was happening. I finally dropped to my knees, tears stinging my eyes. Please, I whispered, my voice hoarse. I don't understand. What do you want from me? The figure shifted closer, moving as though it were weightless, a shadow without substance, yet it seemed to fill the room. You have already made the choice. The voice was no longer just a whisper. It was deep, ancient, like it was speaking from the very depths of time. I clutched my chest, trying to steady my breath, but nothing worked. The air around me was thick and suffocating, warping, bending reality itself. The walls seemed to close in, the floor beneath me unsteady, as if I were losing my grip on everything that I had ever known. I reached for the letters, the only things that seemed to hold any trace of answers. As I touched the first one, I felt it burn my fingertips. It wasn't paper anymore. It was alive and burning with an energy that felt wrong. I pulled my hand back, but it was too late. The letter had already opened, the words inside glowing faintly, growing darker as they spilled from the paper. You have chosen. You have always chosen, the voice said, its tone almost smug now. The room around me began to shake, as if the world itself was coming apart. I could hear the walls cracking, the windows rattling, as if reality was unraveling, thread by thread. I was slipping, falling, into what? The figure moved again, closer, until its shadow was swallowing me whole. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel it, its cold, suffocating presence, pressing down on me like the weight of the world itself. And then, I heard it. The sound of something tearing. It wasn't just the walls or the windows or the floor, something deeper was being ripped apart. My mind. My memories. My very existence. The letters were still in my hands, though I no longer held them. They had merged with me somehow, as though they were a part of my skin. I had written them. I had warned myself. But why? What had I been trying to save? I wanted to scream, but no sound came. I wanted to move, but my body refused to obey. I was trapped. I was trapped inside this thing. It's already too late. I couldn't tell if the voice was inside my head anymore. It felt like it was everywhere. The world was melting. My body was becoming part of the darkness. And then, everything stopped. For a brief, fleeting moment, there was silence. The kind of silence that makes you believe that everything has ended, that there's no longer any sound in the world. But it wasn't over. No, not yet. I looked around, my heart in my throat. The figure was gone. The room was still. But the letters were everywhere now. And this time, they were written in my own hand. I didn't know how long I had been standing there, paralyzed by fear and confusion. The silence in the room felt thick, like something had settled, something ancient and unyielding. But even in that stillness, I knew, deep down, that the worst wasn't over. I moved slowly, cautiously, my steps unsure, as if the ground beneath me could shift at any moment. My eyes darted around the room, searching for any trace of the figure. But there was nothing. Just the letters, hundreds of them, scattered across the floor, covering every inch, as if they had always been there, waiting for me. I reached for one, the closest to me, the one at the edge of the pile. It was warm to the touch, like the heat of a freshly written page. I unrolled it, the words almost glowing in the dim light of the room. "You will never escape." I dropped the letter as though it had burned me. I could hear the blood rushing in my ears, my pulse hammering in my chest. I tried to steady my breath, but it was no use. The panic was too overwhelming. I tried to convince myself that it was all a trick, that none of this was real, but deep down, I knew the truth. The letters, the figure, the strange and twisting reality around me, this was all part of something I couldn't understand, something I had no control over. I had been warned. I had already made my choice. But I didn't know what that choice was, or how to undo it. The door behind me slammed shut with a force that made the walls shake. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. I hadn't even heard the door open. I rushed to it, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. I yanked it, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked. No, there was no lock. The door was simply gone. It was part of the wall now, seamless, as if it had never been there. I backed away, panic setting in, my breathing becoming erratic. The walls were closing in again, the room shrinking, suffocating me with its heat and weight. "You can't leave. You've already chosen." I froze, the voice louder now, and closer. I looked around frantically, but there was nothing except the letters and the creeping darkness that seemed to move on its own. I felt it then, a presence behind me, cold and heavy. Slowly, I turned around. The figure was there again, standing just a few feet away. It hadn't moved, yet somehow it had grown larger, its shadow stretching across the room, consuming everything in its path. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its eyes on me, piercing through my very soul. It was watching me, waiting. "You are running out of time." The words echoed in my mind, and I knew, truly knew, that time was slipping away. Not just time as I understood it, but time itself, the very fabric of it, was bending and breaking. The letters were proof of that. My memories, my life, were slipping through my fingers like sand. I turned away from the figure, desperate to do something, anything. I stumbled over the scattered letters, my hands shaking as I tried to push them aside. I couldn't breathe. The walls felt like they were closing in on me, and the air was thick with the weight of something terrible, something that had been waiting for me all along. I reached for the nearest letter, my mind whirling. I had to understand. I had to make sense of this. I unrolled it, and the words struck me like a blow to the chest. "It's already happening." My breath caught in my throat. It felt like the ground beneath me shifted, like I was falling, like reality itself was crumbling away. The letters had never been warnings. They were records. The past. The future. The words on the paper, their meaning, their purpose, they were never meant to stop what was happening. They were meant to remind me of it. To make me remember. And then, everything clicked. I had seen these letters before. I had written them before. I had been here before. The realization hit me like a flood of cold water. I wasn't in the present anymore. I wasn't even sure what was real. Time had looped. The letters. The figure. The voice. This house. The room. I had been through this cycle again and again, trying, failing, and always returning to the same point. I was trapped in a never-ending loop. I could feel the weight of the truth settle into my bones. No matter what I did, no matter how hard I tried, I could never escape this place. The letters would always find me. The figure would always be there. The voice would always whisper its cold, inevitable truth. And I would always write the letters again. I stood still, surrounded by the sea of letters. The words that covered the floor, the walls, even the ceiling, began to swirl together, creating a dizzying effect that made my head spin. The darkness that had filled the room now felt suffocating, a living thing pressing against me, suffocating me. There is no escape. I could feel it now. Every part of me was part of this cycle. Every step I took, every word I spoke, every breath I drew, had already been written, had already been lived. There was no past. There was no future. There was only the loop. Only this moment, this repetition, this inevitable conclusion. I stumbled backward, my body moving without my consent. The weight of the realization felt like an anchor around my heart. The letters, the warnings, everything was just a reflection of what I had already done. I had already chosen this path, and now I was bound to it. The figure, the presence that had haunted me, loomed in front of me again. It was no longer a shadow, no longer a faceless being. It was me. Or at least, it felt like me. The same eyes, the same expression, but twisted, wrong. The reflection of what I was becoming. The thing I had feared from the very beginning. You will write the final letter. The voice was my own now, but it wasn't my voice. It was the voice of the one who had always been there, watching, waiting. The one who had always known what I would do. The one who had always known how it would end. I couldn't speak. My mouth felt dry, my tongue heavy. But I understood now. The final letter had always been waiting. It was always the end, and always the beginning. I dropped to my knees, the letters around me swirling like a storm. My hands shook uncontrollably, but they reached out, almost as if they were guided by some unseen force, pulling me towards the paper, the pen, the inevitable fate that awaited me. I couldn't stop myself. I wrote. The words spilled from my hand, as if they had always been there, waiting to be written. My own hand moved without hesitation, forming the letters on the page. I could feel the pressure of the ink, the weight of the pen, but more than that, I could feel the weight of my decision. It was the same message as all the others. You have already chosen. The moment the ink dried, the room seemed to freeze. The air grew colder, the shadows deeper. For the briefest moment, I felt nothing. No terror. No fear. No anger. Only a chilling emptiness. And then, the voice spoke again, this time softer, but unmistakable. You will forget. But you will always write. The letters around me began to fade, dissolving into the air, as if they were never really there. The room, the figure, the cycle, it all began to blur. The world around me collapsed, and yet it felt familiar. I woke up. My eyes opened to the dim light of morning. The familiar surroundings of my room greeted me, a room I had seen countless times. For a moment, I wondered if it had all been a dream. The letters, the figure, the endless loop. But then, I noticed something on the desk beside my bed. A letter. I reached for it, my fingers trembling as I turned it over. The handwriting was unmistakable, mine. The ink still fresh, the paper warm to the touch. I opened it. You have already chosen. The room around me began to blur again, the edges of reality bending and twisting as the cycle repeated once more. Have you ever felt like you were being watched? Not just a glance or an accidental stare, but something deeper, like someone is following you, mimicking your every move, always just out of reach. It was late. The night had stretched its black fingers across the sky, wrapping the world in a thick blanket of quiet. I was driving alone on a long, deserted stretch of highway. The headlights of my car cut through the darkness, casting long shadows that danced along the road. The rhythmic hum of the engine was the only sound in the vast emptiness. The only other sign of life was a car ahead of me. It had been in the distance for miles, barely visible against the dark expanse, but something about it felt wrong. At first, I thought it was just another car, some lonely traveler on this long stretch of road. But then, as I got closer, I noticed something odd. The license plate. It was the same as mine. I blinked, sure that my eyes were playing tricks on me. There were no other cars around, so how could it be? Maybe it was some strange coincidence, an illusion created by the headlights and the shadows. But the closer I got, the more the car seemed to match mine in every way, the make, the model, even the rust on the back bumper. I couldn't help myself. I had to get closer, see it for myself. Maybe it was some kind of prank or mistake. Maybe there was an explanation. I pressed my foot harder on the accelerator, closing the gap between us. The car ahead remained eerily calm, steady in its speed, as if it was waiting for me. As I moved closer, a strange unease began to crawl up my spine. The road felt emptier, lonelier. There was no sign of any other vehicles, no streetlights. Just the sound of my engine and the low hum of the tires on the asphalt. But then, something shifted. I leaned forward, squinting at the rearview mirror. My heart raced as I noticed a figure in the car ahead. It was hard to make out the details, but the silhouette was unmistakable. It looked like me. A strange, unsettling reflection. The figure was sitting in the driver's seat, their hands gripping the wheel, their posture identical to mine. It was as if I was looking at a ghost of myself, someone who had gotten in the car before me, someone who had been on this road for longer than I had. I could feel my pulse quickening. My breath came in short, shallow gasps. I wanted to turn away, but something kept pulling me forward, pushing me closer to that car, that reflection of myself. Was it really me, or was it someone else who had somehow become my twin? The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I had to know. I had to catch up with it. There was no turning back now. But as I sped up, the car ahead seemed to match my pace, maintaining its distance from me, neither speeding up nor slowing down. The headlights of my car illuminated the road ahead, but the shadow of the car remained just out of reach. It was like I was chasing a dream, something just beyond my grasp. The figure in the car ahead didn't move. It remained perfectly still, watching me. Or at least, I thought it was watching me. The further I drove, the more I felt something inside me shift, like the road was leading me somewhere I couldn't understand. The hum of the engine became louder, more oppressive. It was as if the car itself was alive, breathing with me, urging me on. And then, I saw it. In the distance, just before the next turn, the road seemed to stretch endlessly into the black void. The headlights illuminated nothing, just a vast, empty space. The car ahead, my twin, had vanished. It was gone. The road stretched before me, empty and infinite. I slammed on the brakes, my heart hammering in my chest. I was alone. But was I? I stared into the darkness ahead. Somewhere out there, my twin, myself, was still driving. And I was still chasing. I pulled the car over to the side of the road, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. It couldn't be real, could it? I had seen my reflection, but there was no logical explanation for it. I turned off the engine, the world suddenly quiet, the eerie hum of the tires on asphalt gone. The silence was deafening, pressing on me from all sides. I glanced at the empty road behind me, hoping to catch a glimpse of the car that had vanished, but there was nothing. Just the endless stretch of dark highway. I took a deep breath and stepped out of the car. The cool night air hit my face, the kind of chill that makes you shiver but also sharpens your senses. I looked around, but there was no sign of the car, no headlights in the distance. Nothing. The road was just a straight line of asphalt, stretching endlessly in both directions. How had it disappeared so quickly? How had it been there 1 second and gone the next? I stood there, frozen, trying to wrap my mind around it. My heart was still pounding in my chest. It felt like something had shifted, something I couldn't name. It wasn't just the car, it was the feeling that I wasn't alone on this road anymore. That thing, the reflection of myself, had to have been real, right? I hesitated for a moment before getting back into the car. The engine roared to life with a start, and I pulled back onto the road. The headlights cut through the dark again, but now, instead of feeling like a comfort, they seemed to highlight the emptiness around me. The further I drove, the more I felt the strange sensation creeping up my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The road seemed to stretch longer, more isolated. Every turn felt like it led nowhere. Every mile seemed to bring me closer to something, but I couldn't tell what. The silence was unsettling now. The usual sounds of the car, the engine, the tires, the hum of the wind were all there, but there was something else. It was a subtle change, a shift in the atmosphere, like the world itself had become thinner, more fragile. I glanced at the rearview mirror again. The reflection was the same as always, my tired eyes, my messy hair. But then, something strange happened. The reflection seemed to shift, just for a split second. The figure in the mirror didn't move the way I did. It was as if it wasn't me at all. I jerked my gaze away, feeling my pulse spike. Was I losing my mind? Had I imagined everything? The car, the figure, was it just exhaustion playing tricks on me? But deep down, I knew. I wasn't imagining it. I pressed harder on the accelerator, my grip tightening on the wheel. I had to find out what was going on. I had to know what was happening, even if I didn't understand it. The road seemed endless, the night stretching out in front of me like an unbroken sea of black. I kept driving, the feeling of dread growing heavier with every passing minute. I glanced at the dashboard. The clock showed that only an hour had passed since I first saw the car ahead of me, yet it felt like I had been driving for days. The time seemed wrong. The world seemed wrong. I couldn't shake the thought of my reflection, the way it had seemed different. And now, as I drove, I felt something shifting in the air, like the road itself was changing. The darkness outside seemed to press in closer, thicker, as if the night was swallowing me whole. The headlights ahead flickered for a brief moment, and then, in the distance, I saw something. A figure, standing by the side of the road. It was too far away to make out details, but the silhouette looked familiar. Too familiar. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching on the pavement as the car came to a sudden stop. My heart was racing again. I couldn't tell if it was the same figure from before or someone else. But I had to know. I had to face it. I opened the door and stepped into the cold night air. The figure didn't move, just stood there in the darkness. My breath caught in my throat as I took a step toward it. And then, I saw it. The reflection of the car's headlights caught the figure, and in that brief moment, I realized it wasn't just someone standing there. It was me. My heart dropped. The figure was me. My body froze as the implications crashed down on me. How could this be? How was this possible? And then the voice came. "Why are you following me?" it asked. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. The figure, the twin, stepped forward, a small, cruel smile on its face. "You should have stayed home." I stood there, paralyzed by the impossible sight of myself staring back at me. The figure was identical to me in every way. The same tired eyes, the same messy hair, the same worn-out jacket I had been wearing for days. It looked like me, moved like me, but it wasn't me. I could feel it deep in my gut. The words, "Why are you following me?" echoed in my mind, but they didn't make sense. I hadn't been following anyone. Or had I? Had I been chasing myself this whole time, trying to outrun something I didn't understand? The figure took another step closer, its smile never faltering, and I instinctively took a step back. My breath came in shallow gasps, the cold air biting at my skin, but the dread inside me was worse than the chill. "What are you?" I managed to ask, my voice trembling. The figure didn't answer immediately. It just stood there, watching me, its eyes scanning me in a way that felt too familiar and yet completely alien. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. Then, finally, it spoke again, its voice low and flat, but with an undertone of something menacing. "I'm you. I've always been you." I recoiled, my heart pounding. "No," I whispered. "You're not me." The figure's smile widened, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that you see on someone who knows something you don't, someone who's in control of a situation you can't comprehend. "I am," it repeated, its voice growing colder. "And you've been following me. You're just too blind to see it." I shook my head, my mind spinning. I had no idea what it was talking about. I had been driving, trying to get away from whatever was chasing me. I wasn't following anyone. I was just trying to escape. But as I looked at the figure again, something deep inside me shifted. A realization crept up my spine, cold and sharp. It wasn't just that the figure looked like me. It wasn't just that it was standing there, mimicking my every move. No, there was something deeper. This thing, this version of me, was something I could never escape. It was like a shadow, something always lurking just beyond my reach. It was the thing I had been running from all along. I tried to speak, but my voice caught in my throat. What was I supposed to say? How could I even begin to make sense of this? The figure took another step forward, its eyes never leaving mine. It was close now, too close. The air between us felt thick, suffocating. It reached out, slowly, its hand stretching toward me. Instinctively, I took another step back, my heart racing. Stay away from me. But the figure didn't stop. It reached out further, its hand almost touching mine, and as it did, I felt an electric shock shoot through my body, like a jolt of pure fear. The world around me seemed to blur and distort, as if the very fabric of reality was beginning to warp. "You can't escape it," it said, its voice a mere whisper now. "This is your fate. You've always been following me." In a sudden, frantic movement, I turned and ran, not even looking back. My footsteps were heavy in the gravel, each one echoing in the stillness of the night. The sound of my breathing was all I could hear, ragged and desperate. But as I ran, I felt something behind me. A presence. The unmistakable sensation that I was being chased. That thing, the version of me, was right there, closing in. I glanced back, but there was no one. The figure was gone. I stumbled to a stop, panting heavily, my heart pounding. What was happening? I had to get out of here. I had to get away. But where was I going? The road stretched endlessly ahead, just like before. The same familiar, lonely stretch of highway. The same oppressive darkness. I turned back toward my car, desperate for some kind of escape, but as I did, I noticed something strange. The headlights of the car were still on, casting long, eerie shadows across the road. But when I looked closer, I saw something in the reflection. A figure. Sitting in the driver's seat. I froze. My blood ran cold. It was me. My reflection, sitting there, motionless, staring straight ahead. I moved closer, my legs shaking beneath me. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if the very ground was trying to pull me down. I reached for the door handle, and as I touched it, I felt a cold, clammy sensation, like my skin was being pulled by invisible hands. I yanked the door open and slid into the driver's seat, my heart racing. The interior was cold, but nothing seemed out of place. It was just normal. Except the reflection in the rearview mirror. It was still there, staring at me. The other version of myself. The one that wasn't me. "Stop running," it whispered, its voice low and familiar. "You can't hide from what you are." I stared at my reflection, unable to look away. My mind was swirling with questions, with doubts. What was real? What was happening? And most terrifying of all, what if I was the one who was being followed? The road stretched endlessly before me, the night still swallowing everything in its wake. But now, it felt like the road itself was shifting, changing with each passing second. The world around me wasn't the same anymore. It had become something warped, something unrecognizable. I could feel it in my bones. I sat there in the driver's seat, hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The reflection, or was it really a reflection, still stared at me, its eyes locked with mine in the rearview mirror. My breath came in short bursts, shallow and frantic. I couldn't look away from it. That face, so like mine, but not. It was too perfect. Too calm. I shifted in my seat, trying to get a better view of the road ahead, but the sight of my reflection in the mirror made my stomach churn. I had to break free from this, from the doubt, from the unease clawing at my chest. But something inside me told me I was already too far gone. Whatever was happening, I couldn't outrun it. It was already inside me, inside my mind. "Stop running," the reflection whispered again, and this time I could hear the undertone of mockery in its voice. "You're only making it worse." I slammed my hand against the steering wheel in frustration. "Shut up," I yelled. But the reflection didn't flinch. It just continued to stare, waiting, watching, judging. The air in the car felt heavier, colder, as if the very space around me was thickening with something dark. I had to escape. I had to get away from this thing. I tore my gaze away from the mirror and pressed my foot down harder on the accelerator. The engine roared to life, and the car lurched forward, its headlights slicing through the dark. But the road, it was wrong. The scenery passed by too fast. The trees lining the roadside were blurry, indistinct, as if they were part of some twisted illusion. And the lines of the road twisted, too, as if they were alive, reshaping themselves with every turn. I slammed my foot on the brake, my heart racing. The car screeched to a halt. The headlights illuminated the empty stretch of highway ahead, but the sense of something wrong was growing stronger. There was something out there, something waiting. "Don't you see?" The voice in my mind was now louder than the sound of my heartbeat. It was a voice I knew well. A voice that sounded like mine, yet twisted into something else. "You've been chasing me all along. You think you're running away from me, but the truth is, I'm you." I tried to push the voice out, tried to focus on the road, but my mind was spiraling. My vision blurred. It was as if my own thoughts were turning against me, unraveling everything I thought I knew. I slammed the door open and stepped out of the car, the cold air biting at my skin. My legs were unsteady beneath me. I stumbled and caught myself on the hood, my breath visible in the freezing air. Everything around me felt strange, distorted, like I was no longer standing in the world I knew. It was as if I had crossed into a place where nothing made sense, where time itself was unraveling. A low rumble sounded from behind me. I turned, half expecting to see the other version of me standing there, but there was nothing. No figure. No reflection. Just the night stretching on and on. But the sound didn't fade. It was growing louder, more insistent. And it was coming from the car. The engine was still running. I slowly turned back toward the vehicle. The headlights gleamed brightly in the dark, casting long shadows across the road. The engine hummed in a way that sent chills down my spine. There was something about it. Something unnatural. And then I saw it. The reflection. It was no longer in the rearview mirror. It was in the driver's seat again. I was sitting there, but I wasn't moving. It was just sitting there. My own hands were gripping the wheel, but they weren't mine. They were the hands of someone else, someone I didn't recognize. They were cold, lifeless. The figure in the seat turned to look at me. Its eyes met mine, and the same smile I had seen earlier stretched across its face. But this time, it wasn't mocking. It was something worse. It was triumphant. "You were always meant to be here," the reflection said. Its voice was colder, more distant. "You were always meant to follow me." I felt the weight of its words sink deep into my chest. It wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't just a case of mistaken identity. I wasn't just chasing a car, I had been chasing myself. My other self. The one that had always been there, lurking just behind the veil of my mind. I stumbled backward, the ground beneath me seeming to shift with every step. I could feel myself unraveling. My own mind was slipping away, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. And then a thought hit me. The most terrifying thought of all. What if this had always been my reality? What if I had never been running away? What if I had always been running toward this moment? The world around me began to spin. The road, the car, the figure, they were all merging together into one indistinct blur, a mass of twisting shapes and shadows. The sky above seemed to crack and fracture, like glass shattering. I reached out, desperate to hold onto something, anything. But my fingers brushed against nothing. There was nothing left. Just the darkness. Just the cold. And then everything went black. I woke up with a start, gasping for air. The overwhelming sense of emptiness, of having been lost for so long, lingered in my chest. My body was stiff, my skin cold, and my head throbbed with the remnants of a nightmare I couldn't fully remember. But there was something else, something I couldn't quite place, the feeling that I hadn't just been asleep. I was still on the road. The car was parked by the side of the highway. The engine hummed softly, as if it had never stopped running. I reached out to touch the door handle, but my hand trembled, as though my body didn't want to move. Slowly, cautiously, I opened the door and stepped out into the night. The air was still biting cold, but now it felt different. Less real. The road stretched before me, dark and endless, the lines on the asphalt appearing almost surreal. The headlights illuminated the emptiness ahead, but there was something strange in the way they flickered, like they were fighting against the night. I felt like I was standing on the edge of something unknown, something terrifying. I turned around, scanning my surroundings, but the car behind me was gone. The reflection, the other me, was nowhere to be seen. The highway was empty, and for a moment, the silence felt almost comforting. But then, I heard it. A sound, low and distant, coming from somewhere ahead. The hum of an engine. But it wasn't the smooth hum of a car's motor. It was deeper, rougher. Almost unnatural. I felt my pulse quicken as the sound grew louder, drawing closer. I turned around, scanning the road again. My heart skipped a beat as the headlights of another car appeared on the horizon, coming fast, as if chasing me. I squinted into the darkness, but the shape of the vehicle was still too far away to make out. However, the closer it came, the more I could feel the familiar chill running down my spine. The car drew closer, and with it, that sense of dread settled deeper into my bones. I couldn't stop myself from looking. I couldn't help but watch as the car neared. And then, it stopped. The engine cut out abruptly, the headlights glaring directly at me. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it, but I knew. I already knew what it was. The figure inside, it wasn't just someone else. It was me. It was always me. I could see my reflection in the windshield, staring out from behind the glass. But this time, it wasn't a mirror image. It wasn't a simple duplicate. It was me. Or at least, the idea of me. The part of me that had been running, that had been chasing, and now, the part of me that had nowhere else to go. I took a step back, my breath shallow. The air felt thick, like the world itself was folding in on me. I could hear the faint sound of my own voice, distant, echoing in my mind, like a whisper from somewhere far away. "You were always meant to be here," the voice said. But this time, it wasn't a threat. It wasn't mocking. It was resigned. The car remained still, its headlights cutting through the dark. The world seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something to happen, waiting for me to understand. And then it hit me. The realization that everything had been a loop, a cycle I had been trapped in for who knows how long. The car, the road, the reflection, they were all part of the same endless journey. And I wasn't just a passenger. I was both the traveler and the destination. I had never been running toward anything. I had only been running away from myself. The world began to distort again, like a dream unraveling. The car in front of me was disappearing, fading into the night. The road stretched endlessly in both directions, the horizon blurring into nothingness. And as the darkness closed in around me, I realized with a sinking feeling that there would never be an end. I would never escape this road. This thing I had been chasing. It would always be there, just ahead, waiting for me to catch up. I was the reflection, and the reflection was me. The car's engine roared back to life. The road continued, without end, without beginning. Just a stretch of highway leading to nowhere. And I was left standing there, alone in the night, knowing that I would never be free. Have you ever been watched, but never felt it? Have you ever been sure something was there, but when you looked, it was gone? I started noticing the shadows first. It was subtle. At first, I told myself it was just fatigue. Maybe I hadn't slept well, or maybe I was imagining things. But it wasn't just me. Others saw it too. The shadows weren't just silhouettes anymore. They were moving, shifting. Not with the people they belonged to, but on their own. It started on ordinary Tuesday. I was walking down the street, lost in thought, when I noticed a man ahead of me. His shadow was different. It wasn't just a dark reflection of his body, it moved. It jerked slightly, like something trying to break free. The man didn't seem to notice. His own shadow stretched and twisted, but he walked on, unaware. I thought it was just a trick of the light, maybe a flicker in the street lamp. But then it happened again. I was sitting in a cafe, watching people as they moved through the door. One by one, their shadows stretched in ways they shouldn't. They swayed, they shivered, and in one instance, I swear a man's shadow reached out and touched the ground beside him before pulling back sharply, like it had a mind of its own. That night, I found myself sitting in my apartment, staring at my own shadow. The room was dim, the only light coming from a single lamp beside me. My shadow sat still on the wall in front of me, almost too still. It should have been moving with me, but it wasn't. My hand twitched, and I watched, horrified, as my shadow seemed to remain frozen, unmoving, like it was waiting for something. I stood up and stepped toward the lamp, thinking maybe the angle of the light was wrong. But as I moved, I saw it. My shadow was no longer in sync with me. It lingered behind, dragging in slow, deliberate movements. It stretched unnaturally, as if it was trying to escape the confines of my body. The longer I stared at it, the more I felt that the air around me was shifting, becoming thicker, heavier. I shook my head and forced myself to look away. "It's nothing," I muttered to myself, trying to rationalize it. But deep down, something inside me knew I wasn't imagining it. I wasn't alone. The next day, I saw more of it, other shadows shifting in ways that weren't right. I saw a woman walking down the street, her shadow gliding along the ground like it was being pulled by invisible strings. It stretched and twisted in odd shapes, as if it had a will of its own. I stopped dead in my tracks, unable to tear my eyes away. Her shadow, wasn't hers. It was moving independently, as though the figure it followed didn't belong in this world. I tried to talk to people about it, but no one believed me. They laughed it off, calling me paranoid, or told me I was seeing things. Even when I pointed it out to them, they couldn't see it. Only I could. Only I was cursed to watch the world unravel before my eyes, as the shadows of those around me gained lives of their own. The worst part? It wasn't just the people. My own shadow had started to behave differently. It began to lag behind, not following my movements as it once did. When I looked at it in the corner of my eye, it seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally. And sometimes, late at night, I could swear I saw it moving even when I stood perfectly still. I began to avoid looking at it altogether, but the sense of being watched, of being followed, never left me. I would look in a mirror, and for just a moment, the shadow in the reflection would behave differently than I did. It was as though it was waiting for the perfect moment to break free. What made it worse was that I knew I wasn't imagining it. This wasn't a figment of my tired mind. The shadows were alive, or something close to it. And as I walked through the streets, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't just being watched. I was being hunted. Everywhere I went, it seemed like more people were noticing the strange behavior of their own shadows. It was as if the world itself was beginning to unravel, piece by piece, as these dark, unholy figures slowly took shape. I didn't know where to turn. Every day, the shadows grew bolder. I began to notice them staring at me, hovering just out of sight, waiting for me to make a mistake. They never made a sound. They never moved too fast. But the longer I watched, the more I understood. They were getting closer. I don't know when it started, but I began to feel a cold weight on my shoulders, like a presence I couldn't shake. My own shadow, ever so slowly, began to move closer to me, inch by inch. Each step I took, it mirrored me, but it wasn't quite right. It was as if something was in the shadows, watching, waiting, ready to make its move. And when I looked back, it was always there, closer than before. Now, I can't walk down the street without feeling that dark weight behind me, creeping closer with every passing second. The shadows are growing bolder, more unpredictable. I hear them at night, scraping against the walls, shifting in the corners of my room. I know they're watching. I don't know what they want. But I know one thing for sure, it's only a matter of time before they take me too. I couldn't escape them. Every time I tried to focus on something else, to convince myself I was being paranoid, I felt the eyes of the shadows watching me. It wasn't just that they were moving, they were following me, mimicking me. But now, I knew they weren't just following. They were learning, adapting. I'd gone to the park, trying to clear my head, trying to find something, anything, that would convince me I wasn't losing my mind. But as I sat on the bench, my gaze flicked over to a man walking his dog. His shadow stretched unnaturally far ahead, as if it had a will of its own. It slithered on the pavement, curving around the dog, but never quite matching the way the dog moved. It was as if the shadow was trying to separate itself from the man entirely. I felt the bile rise in my throat. I couldn't breathe. I had to leave. But as I stood to go, I noticed something that stopped me cold. There was a shadow in front of me. Not mine, not anyone else's. Just a shadow. It didn't belong to anyone. It hovered in the corner of my vision, too close, too thick. When I turned my head to look at it directly, it was gone. But I knew it was there. I could feel it. It was waiting for me. I ran back to my apartment, heart pounding, the sensation of being hunted growing stronger with each step. I locked the door behind me, hands shaking as I fumbled with the deadbolt. I turned around, expecting my shadow to be just as it always had been. But when I looked at the floor, I couldn't see it. I froze. I had moved into a patch of dim light, and my shadow should have been stretched across the floor. Instead, it was nowhere to be seen. I stepped forward, but still, nothing. My own figure in the room was only half visible, with no shadow to follow. I took a breath, forcing my legs to move as I walked closer to the light switch. My mind raced, thoughts colliding, scrambling for some explanation. Maybe the light was broken. Maybe the room was too dark. But no! It wasn't that. I flicked the switch. Still nothing. And then, I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible rustle. The smallest shift in the air, but it made the hairs on my neck stand on end. I turned around quickly, scanning the apartment. The kitchen was silent. The living room, still. But then I saw it, just on the edge of the hallway, where the shadows met the walls. A shape. I couldn't tell what it was. It looked like a shadow, but it wasn't quite right. It was too dark, too dense. It didn't flicker or dance like shadows usually do. No, this one stood still, unmoving, but somehow alive. It seemed to pulse, expanding and contracting as if it was breathing. I moved closer, my heart hammering in my chest, but the shape didn't move. It stayed there, watching me, waiting for me to come closer. I reached out instinctively, but stopped myself just before my fingers brushed the edge of the shadow. My mind screamed at me to stay away, but my body didn't listen. I leaned in, and the moment my hand got too close, the shadow shifted. It grew, stretching toward me, pulling at the very air, until it touched my fingers. I jerked back, but the touch lingered. There was a coldness to it, a freezing, unnatural chill that sunk straight into my bones. I looked at my hand. It was shaking, trembling as though the cold had seeped inside me. And then I saw it, the shadow, or whatever it was, streaked across the room like it had a mind of its own. It was fast. Faster than anything I could comprehend. I spun around, looking at every corner of the apartment, expecting it to come for me. And then I saw it again. This time, it was clearer. It was my shadow. But not just mine. The figure that stood beside me, perfectly mirroring my movements, wasn't me. It wasn't just a reflection of me. It was something else, something darker, something alive. Its limbs stretched too far, too unnaturally long. Its face didn't mirror mine, but I could feel its eyes. Cold. Empty. Watching. I stepped back, almost tripping over my own feet. My own reflection was no longer just a mimic, it was a presence. A malicious presence. That's when I realized the truth. The shadows weren't just moving anymore. They were becoming something else. They weren't content with just following, they wanted to take over. They wanted to erase the person they followed, replace them. And that meant me. I started to panic. The shadows were getting closer, too close, their twisted figures creeping up behind me, over me, filling every corner of the room with their dark weight. I could feel them, their cold hands at my back, pulling at me, threatening to drown me. I needed to get out. I needed to leave. But as I reached for the door, I felt a shift in the air behind me. A cold wind, chilling the very air, pulling at my body. It was my shadow again. But this time, it wasn't just a shadow. It had form. It had substance. And as I looked into the mirror one last time, I saw it standing there behind me, smiling. Or, at least, I thought it was smiling. But it wasn't my smile. It wasn't my face. It was his face. And now, he was free. The room felt smaller now, the air heavier. My heart pounded in my chest as the shadow, I couldn't call it mine anymore, loomed behind me, pressing into my every movement as if it were trying to consume me, to pull me into its void. I rushed toward the door, my fingers trembling as I grasped the handle. The apartment felt like a cage now, its walls pushing in on me, tightening with every second. But the door wouldn't open. No matter how hard I pulled, it stayed locked. The shadow behind me, my shadow, moved, its form shifting, slithering around the edges of the room like a dark cloud. It was waiting for me to make the next move, like a predator playing with its prey. My breath hitched as I turned, but there was no escaping it. I backed away slowly, each step feeling like it took me further into its web. But then, I heard something. A noise from the hallway, faint at first, but unmistakable. It was the sound of footsteps. I wasn't alone anymore. Someone else was out there. I rushed to the window, but it was the same, no escape. Just the vast emptiness of the city streets, silent under the dim glow of streetlights. I was trapped, with only the shadow and the unknown steps outside. The shadow in the room stirred again, its form now beginning to take shape, its edges sharpening into something distinctly human, but not quite. It was tall, unnaturally so, and as I watched, the outline of a face began to emerge. It wasn't just a faceless void now. There was a smile. A dark, twisted smile that didn't belong to anyone I knew. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, but my feet wouldn't move. My mind was racing. Was this real? Was this something that could be happening? I thought back to the first night I noticed it. The feeling of being watched. The way the shadows felt too alive. Was it always like this? Or had I just missed it before? The footsteps outside were getting closer. The shadow, too, moved forward, like it was waiting for something. For me. Then, suddenly, the door opened. I froze. It wasn't a creak or a crack, it was as if the door had simply unlocked on its own. Slowly, I turned to look at the hallway, but before I could make sense of it, the shadow behind me lurched forward. It wasn't slow anymore. It was fast. Its long limbs reached out, grabbing at the air, pulling itself toward me. In that moment, I knew I had no choice. I ran. I dashed for the door, threw it open, and stumbled into the hallway, heart racing as the shadow followed, its form undulating and stretching, sliding against the walls. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't care. I had to escape. But the steps outside were getting closer too. They weren't my footsteps. They were too in sync. They matched my own pace, but they were faster. It was almost as if something, was running right behind me. I turned the corner of the hallway and skidded to a stop, nearly colliding with a figure. My breath caught in my throat. It was me. But it wasn't. Not really. The face was the same, but the eyes, those eyes, were completely different. Empty, dark, and hollow. His smile, too, stretched wider, like it had been waiting to devour me from the moment we met. I stumbled back, feeling the cold presence of the shadow at my back. My own double, my other self, stepped forward, his eyes never leaving mine. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Then, just like that, he reached out. His hand moved as though it were part of his body, unnatural, like a puppet being controlled from somewhere deep inside the darkness. I gasped and turned, running again, but now I could hear it. The unmistakable sound of a second set of footsteps, my footsteps, chasing after me. But I couldn't outrun myself. The hallways stretched out endlessly, twisting in impossible ways, like a maze that had no end. The lights flickered, casting eerie shadows across the walls, but no matter how many corners I turned, he was always right behind me. I ran into another room, but it was more of the same. Endless shadows, endless corridors. The walls seemed to close in, pressing against me, suffocating me. I had to get away. My pulse thundered in my ears, drowning out everything else. I barely registered the fact that I wasn't alone anymore. Everywhere I looked, I saw it, shadows, not just one, but several. They moved, they shifted, each with its own twisted, hollow reflection of me. I didn't know which one was the real one anymore. And then, all at once, they stopped. The footsteps, the shadows, the movement, it all fell silent. I turned to look at the figure closest to me, my own reflection in its face. Its eyes, those hollow eyes, stared back at me, unblinking. The silence felt like a warning. The shadows were no longer pursuing, no longer chasing. They were waiting for me to make the next move. I was surrounded, trapped in a never-ending labyrinth of my own making. I couldn't fight them. I couldn't outrun them. And in the silence, I heard a voice, soft, cold, and unmistakably mine. You can't hide. The world went black. I awoke with a start, gasping for breath. The darkness around me felt oppressive, thick, as if the very air itself was alive. My heart pounded in my chest, and for a moment, I thought I was still trapped in that labyrinth, still running, still hunted by those twisted versions of myself. But the air was too still. The silence, too complete. I was no longer in the hallway. I was somewhere else. I rubbed my eyes, trying to adjust to the suffocating dark. Slowly, the faint outlines of the room around me began to take shape. The walls were made of rough, jagged stone, and the floor beneath me felt cold and uneven. It was like being in some forgotten underground cavern, lost in the dark, with only the echoes of my own breath to guide me. I stood up shakily, my legs weak beneath me. The air felt thicker here, more oppressive. The weight of it seemed to press down on me from every direction. And then I heard it. A faint whisper, as if carried by the wind. It was my name. I froze. My blood ran cold. It wasn't just the sound of the whisper, it was the tone, the way it seemed to come from all around me, as if the very walls were alive. As if the shadows themselves were calling to me. You're not alone, the whisper breathed. It was a voice, but not quite. Hollow. Far away. A memory. The shadows in the room began to stir. At first, it was subtle, like a trick of the light, but then they grew, swirling and curling, creeping toward me. Their movement wasn't normal. They were too fluid, too unnatural. Each shadow seemed to have a life of its own, a mind of its own, and they all converged on me. I took a step back, but the shadows followed. I couldn't escape. They moved faster than I did, encircling me, closing in. And then I saw it. In the midst of the shadows, a figure slowly took shape, tall, thin, with its head cocked to the side like it was studying me. It was me, but not. The same face, the same features, but twisted, warped. The eyes were wide, hollow, and empty, staring straight through me as if they could see into my very soul. "You shouldn't have followed," it whispered, its voice echoing in the shadows, reverberating off the stone walls. "You've already lost." I backed away, my legs shaking with fear, but the figure didn't move. It stood there, watching, as the shadows continued to crawl around me, their shapes shifting and growing larger, more menacing. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to obey. Every instinct screamed at me to fight, to flee, but my feet were frozen to the ground. The shadow figure grinned, a twisted, unnatural smile that stretched too wide for a human face. "It's too late," it said. "There's no escaping what you are. You're already part of this place. Part of us." I could feel my pulse quicken as the shadows closed in tighter, their edges growing sharper, more defined. They weren't just darkness anymore. They were something else, something alive. The shadows pressed against my skin, the coldness seeping into my bones, paralyzing me. I had to get out. I had to escape. But where was I? How had I gotten here? I couldn't remember. Everything was blurry, like a dream I couldn't wake up from. The shadows seemed to warp time itself, pulling me deeper into their depths. The figure moved closer, its shadow stretching along the floor like an endless void. Its hands reached toward me, long fingers stretching and twisting like they were made of darkness itself. "You were always going to find us," it whispered, its breath cold against my ear. "And now we will find you." Suddenly, a sharp pain shot through my chest, like 1,000 needles piercing my skin. I gasped, stumbling backward, but the shadows were faster. They rushed toward me, engulfing me in their cold embrace, dragging me deeper into the darkness. I fought. I screamed. I tried to break free, but the shadows pulled me down, smothering me, suffocating me. And then, the light. It flickered, just for a moment, a distant, dim light breaking through the thick, consuming blackness. I reached for it, desperate, clawing at the edges of the void that surrounded me. My hands touched something solid, something warm, fingers, human fingers. I turned, hoping to see the source of the light, but instead, I found another face. Another version of me. But this one was different. It wasn't twisted. It wasn't hollow. It was alive. "You're still here," it said, its voice soft but steady, as if it were trying to reassure me. "You don't have to stay." I stared at it, my breath shallow, not understanding. Was this real? Was I dreaming again? "You have to make a choice," the figure continued, its eyes calm but urgent. "You can leave this place. But you must let go of everything you thought you knew." I didn't understand. The shadows were closing in again, their presence overwhelming, their weight crushing me. "Let go," the figure repeated, reaching out, its hand extending toward me. "You can still escape, but only if you let go." I hesitated. The shadows were almost upon me. The figure's hand was right there, but what did it mean? What was I supposed to let go of? The darkness pressed in, the figures of my other selves circling closer. The whispers grew louder, more frantic. And then I realized I was the shadow. I was always the shadow. I had become a part of this place. There was no escaping it. No matter how far I ran, no matter what I tried, I had always been lost. In that moment, I let go. The world around me shattered. The darkness consumed me whole, but in the depths of it, I saw light. A fleeting glimpse of something real, something that was mine. Then, everything went quiet, and I awoke. But the shadows, they were still there, watching, waiting, and I knew there was no way out anymore. I awoke with a sharp inhale, my body jerking upright as the memories flooded back, distorted, fragmented, like shards of a broken mirror. The room I was in was unfamiliar, yet eerily recognizable. It was the same room I had started in, the same dim light, the same stone walls. But everything felt wrong. The air tasted heavy, as if the atmosphere had been suffused with 1,000 secrets that could never be told. I reached up to rub my face, and that's when I saw it. The reflection in the mirror was me. Or, rather, it was supposed to be. The figure staring back at me had my face, my eyes, but there was something else. A subtle difference, like a small crack running through the surface of a calm lake, revealing the darkness underneath. It was me, but it wasn't. I could see the shadow shifting behind my reflection, its movement subtle, almost imperceptible. I stared at the mirror, my pulse quickening. It wasn't just my reflection that moved. There was something else, something lurking behind it. I stepped back, my breath catching in my throat. The shadow behind the reflection was growing, elongating, twisting, until it was no longer just a part of the mirror. It was in the mirror, and it was coming closer. "You're not supposed to be here," the figure in the reflection whispered, its voice a low, hollow murmur. "You were never supposed to wake up." The room seemed to tilt, the floor warping beneath me as the walls stretched outward, pulling me deeper into the darkness. The mirror remained, untouched by the shifting reality around it, and the shadow within it grew larger, more distinct, until it was a solid shape. A figure. A second me, the one I had been running from. I tried to scream, to break free, but the shadows closed in faster, wrapping themselves around my legs, my arms, pulling me toward the mirror. My body fought, every instinct urging me to escape, but there was no way out. The walls closed in on me, the stone creeping forward like living flesh, and the air grew thick with an oppressive weight. The figure in the mirror stretched out a hand, its fingers long and twisted, reaching for me with an unnatural grace. "You're already here," it said, its voice soft but chilling. "And now you're a part of us. You always were." The shadows surged, engulfing me entirely. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I was trapped, tangled in the very essence of the darkness. But just before it consumed me, just before I was lost forever, a flicker of light, distant but real, shone from the depths of the void. It was a single point of clarity, a faint glimmer of hope. I reached for it, pushing against the overwhelming shadows, desperate to touch it, to feel it. For a moment, I thought I was free. I thought I had escaped. But as my fingers brushed against the light, it flickered, dimming and expanding, warping the very fabric of the world around me. The mirror shattered. The room cracked open like glass breaking, and in that moment, I saw it. The truth. The shadows, the reflections, the twisted versions of myself, they were all fragments of a life I had never truly lived. Each decision, each moment, had led me to this breaking point, this fractured reality where I had lost myself. I was both the hunter and the hunted, both the dreamer and the dream, trapped in a loop of my own making, where the lines between the real and the imagined were blurred beyond recognition. As I looked into the shattered remnants of the mirror, I saw the final reflection, the real me, or what was left of me. a faint, broken image that stared back with hollow eyes. I reached out, but it was too late. The darkness consumed me entirely, and as it did, I realized that I had never truly escaped. The shadows weren't just following me, they were me. And the cycle would begin again. It started with a question: have you ever seen something you couldn't explain? I never thought much about it before, but now, as I lie awake in the darkness, I can't stop thinking about those lights. I had always thought the sky was just the sky, nothing more than an endless stretch of black with a few stars scattered across. That night, though, something was different. The night felt strange, charged in a way that I couldn't quite place. It was a still evening, one of those quiet nights when the world seems to hold its breath. I was alone in my apartment, the faint hum of the fridge the only sound in the room. Then I saw them, lights. At first, they looked like the kind of flickering you'd expect from a plane passing far away, but they were too bright, too constant. They hovered, almost motionless, and seemed to shimmer, though not in any way I'd ever seen before. I leaned closer to the window, trying to get a better look. The sky stretched out in front of me, dark and vast, but those lights, those brilliant, glowing dots, held me captive. They moved, just slightly, as if teasing me. I felt my heartbeat quicken. It wasn't natural, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. Maybe it's a satellite, I muttered to myself. But it didn't make sense. It wasn't the right kind of glow, the right kind of movement. It was otherworldly. And yet, I couldn't look away. The longer I stared, the more I felt it. A kind of strange warmth in my chest, spreading outward as if the lights were pulling me in. My thoughts began to scatter, my mind racing to understand what was happening. Was this something new? Something no one had ever seen before? Or was it something far more sinister? The lights flickered, once, twice, and then they disappeared. I blinked, feeling a strange emptiness in the pit of my stomach. Where had they gone? I rushed to the door, stepping out onto the balcony. The air was still cool, the night untouched by any sound. There was nothing in the sky, but I could still feel them. Their presence, like a memory clinging to my senses. I tried to shake off the unsettling feeling that had taken root in my mind. But the question lingered, just like those lights. What had I seen? A few hours passed, but sleep wouldn't come. I lay awake, the eerie glow of the lights still haunting my thoughts. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them flickering in my mind's eye, always present, like they were calling to me. By the time the first rays of sunlight crept through the curtains, I thought I had imagined it all. Maybe I had. Maybe the lights had been nothing more than a trick of the mind, a product of exhaustion or too much screen time. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The air felt different now, even during the day. The world seemed just a little too quiet, a little too still. And then there were the sounds, soft at first, but growing clearer. A shuffling noise, like footsteps, just outside my door. But no one was there. It was just the beginning. The next few days passed slowly, as if the world had decided to move at a different pace. The lights hadn't returned, but something had shifted, something I couldn't explain. It wasn't just the sound, the strange, soft shuffling I kept hearing while I was alone, but a sense of wrongness. It was in the air, in the way the shadows stretched just a little too far, in the way the silence felt too thick. I didn't understand it, but I felt it, deep in my bones. I went about my usual routine, though it felt like I was watching myself from a distance. I would get up, shower, make coffee, but all the while, my mind was somewhere else. Every now and then, my thoughts would drift back to those lights in the sky, and with them came that unsettling feeling. That pull. I couldn't shake it. One evening, as I sat on the couch, flipping through channels on the TV, I heard it again. The shuffling sound, this time more distinct, more urgent. It was coming from the hallway outside my apartment door. I froze, my hand still gripping the remote. I told myself it was nothing, probably just the building settling, the old pipes creaking, or someone walking down the hall. But the sound, it didn't stop. It was too deliberate, too rhythmic. And I couldn't ignore the unease creeping up my spine. I stood, heart pounding, and approached the door. Slowly, I pressed my ear against the cold wood. The sound was clearer now, footsteps. Soft, almost like someone tiptoeing, but they were too close. A sudden thought struck me. What if it wasn't a person? What if it was something else? My mind began to race, flashing back to the lights in the sky. Had they been connected to this? I pulled away from the door, my hands trembling. I wanted to open it, to see who, or what, was out there, but my feet felt glued to the floor. I couldn't move. Just as I was about to take a step back, the sound stopped. Silence. Complete and utter silence. I waited. Nothing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was on the other side of the door, just out of sight. I took a deep breath and opened the door, my body tensing, prepared for anything. But the hallway was empty. There was no one there. I stared into the dimly lit corridor, the faint scent of dust in the air. It was quiet, too quiet. I didn't know what I was expecting, but it certainly wasn't this. There were no shadows moving, no figures lurking in the corners. Nothing out of the ordinary. Yet, I felt it. The weight of something unseen, pressing in from all sides. I stepped back into my apartment and closed the door behind me, locking it as though that would somehow keep whatever had been outside at bay. But I knew that wasn't the case. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach. The feeling was growing stronger. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Whatever had happened with those lights, whatever had started with them, was far from over. It was just beginning. That night, the lights returned. Just as before, they flickered in and out of view, appearing far off in the distance. I rushed to the window again, unable to resist. But this time, the lights were different. They were closer, more intense, almost blinding in their brightness. They seemed to pulse, almost as if they were alive, and I couldn't look away. As I stared, something inside me shifted. My head felt heavy, my thoughts unclear. I knew I should turn away, should pull myself back from the window, but I couldn't. My body wouldn't obey. I was locked in place, caught in the glow of those strange lights. And then, I heard it. The shuffling. But this time, it wasn't coming from outside. It was inside. My own footsteps echoed in the room as I began to walk toward the door. Toward whatever waited for me out there. I could feel my pulse quicken, my breath shallow, but I couldn't stop. Something had taken control. My own body didn't belong to me anymore. And the lights, they kept calling. I stepped outside, the cool night air brushing against my skin. The sounds of the city were muted, as if the world had decided to hold its breath in the presence of something unknown. My legs moved without my command, carrying me down the hallway and toward the stairs. I felt like I was walking in a dream, but the cold metal of the stairwell railing was all too real, sending a jolt through my body. My heart pounded in my chest, but I couldn't stop. The lights outside had become brighter, more overwhelming, pulling at me like magnets. Each step I took felt heavier, as though something invisible was dragging me closer. I didn't want to go, but I couldn't turn back. I reached the street, and there they were, floating above the rooftops. Those lights, swirling and shifting, as if dancing to a rhythm I couldn't hear but felt in every fiber of my being. They had grown larger, now filling the entire sky. The night, once dark and still, now pulsed with their unnatural glow. The lights seemed to be reaching down, like fingers extending from the heavens, calling to me. I stopped in the middle of the street, my breath quick and shallow, staring up at them. The sounds of the world around me seemed to fade away, drowned out by a low hum, almost like a vibration in the air. It was in my bones, in my blood. It was as though the lights were speaking to me, urging me to come closer, to embrace whatever they were offering. But then, something else pierced through the hum, a sound. A whisper. Not in my ears, but in my mind, as if the very air around me was alive, shifting and changing. Come to us. It seemed to say, though I couldn't be sure if I was hearing it or feeling it. Come closer. You belong with us. I stumbled backward, my heart racing. I tried to close my eyes, to block out the sound, but it only grew louder, more insistent. My hands shook as I gripped my head, trying to steady myself. I could feel something inside me shift, something twisting, something dark. It wasn't just the lights now. It was everything around me. The street, the buildings, the trees, they were all warped, shifting in ways that shouldn't have been possible. The shadows stretched unnaturally long, twisting like living things. The air tasted metallic, like a storm was brewing just beyond the horizon. Go to them, the voice whispered again. This time, I knew it was not my own thought. It was something else, something far older and more powerful. I turned and ran. My feet pounded against the pavement, the sound of my breath harsh in my ears. But the further I ran, the stronger the pull became. It was like invisible strings were tying me to those lights, dragging me closer with every step I took. I reached the edge of the city, the lights now so close that they seemed to hover just above my head. I was no longer running on instinct. I was being pulled toward them, against my will. I knew that if I stepped closer, if I let myself get too close, I would never be the same again. But I couldn't stop. My body wouldn't listen. I felt something inside me break, like a dam giving way, and I knew then that I had crossed a point of no return. I reached out, my fingers brushing the air in front of me, and for a moment, everything went still. The lights flickered, and I felt it, a shock, like electricity running through my veins. My mind reeled, a sudden rush of images flooding my thoughts, too fast to comprehend. Faces, places, things I couldn't explain. And then, I saw it, something dark, something alive, lurking in the space between the lights. It reached out to me, its presence like a weight pressing down on my chest. And just like that, everything stopped. I was back in my apartment. But I wasn't the same. The lights were gone, and the hum in the air had faded, leaving only silence. But I felt different, empty, hollow. As if something inside me had been taken. I staggered toward the mirror, my reflection staring back at me, but it wasn't my face I saw. It was distant. Strange. A feeling of wrongness settled deep in my stomach. I wanted to scream, but my voice wouldn't come. I wasn't alone anymore. and the lights weren't gone. They were still there, lurking at the edges of my mind, waiting for me to return. I woke up the next morning, but it didn't feel like morning. The world outside my window was dim, the sunlight somehow muted, as if it had been filtered through a heavy curtain. I stood at the edge of the bed, staring at my hands. They seemed normal, but there was a coldness to them that I hadn't noticed before. A sense of distance. Like I was observing my own life from far away, unable to truly reach it. I looked around my apartment, the familiar walls now feeling foreign, as if they no longer belonged to me. The air was thick, charged with an unseen force, and I could hear it, the faint hum, low and constant. It wasn't in my head this time. It was real. I could feel it vibrating through the floorboards, through the walls, as if it was coming from the very heart of the earth itself. I thought about the lights. Those brilliant, pulsing lights. They hadn't just altered the space around me, they had altered me. I could still hear their call echoing in the back of my mind, like a whisper that wouldn't fade. I tried to push it away, tried to focus on something else, anything else. But the feeling was there, always there, like a shadow just out of sight. I walked to the window, drawn by an invisible force, and looked outside. The sky was clear now, no sign of the lights. But there was something else. The world seemed wrong. The trees outside my window swayed too much, the shadows stretching unnaturally long, as if they were reaching for something. The hum in the air was louder now, vibrating through the very fabric of reality. I shook my head. I had to be imagining it. This couldn't be real. But deep down, I knew it was. The lights, the pull, the strange changes, I wasn't just affected by them. I had become a part of them, and I could feel them inside me now. I turned away from the window, but my body didn't obey. My legs carried me forward, toward the door. I tried to stop, tried to control myself, but the force was too strong. When I opened the door, I wasn't alone. Standing in the hallway, a figure emerged from the shadows. At first, I thought it was a person, but as I looked closer, I saw the truth. This wasn't a person. Not entirely. It was something else. Its shape was human, but its features were wrong, twisted, blurred, as if it was trying to hold onto a form that didn't quite fit. Its eyes were dark, empty pits that seemed to absorb the light around it. And it was staring at me, waiting. A cold wave of terror washed over me. My heart pounded in my chest, but I couldn't move. I couldn't look away. "Come closer," it whispered, its voice like the rustling of dry leaves. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But I couldn't. My body, my mind, they were no longer mine. I took a step forward, my feet moving as though they had a mind of their own. The figure in front of me stepped back, and I followed, drawn into the darkness of the hallway. The air around me grew colder, the silence suffocating. The farther we went, the more the world around me seemed to blur. The walls, the floor, even the light, they all seemed to bend and twist, like I was losing touch with reality. The figure ahead of me was fading in and out of view, its form distorting with every step I took. We reached the stairwell. I felt the chill in the air grow even stronger, the hum vibrating through the stairs beneath my feet. And then, I saw it. The door at the bottom of the stairs. It was unlike any door I had ever seen. Old, rusted, covered in strange symbols that seemed to shift and move as I stared at them. I couldn't look away. The figure had stopped, waiting for me to approach. The door seemed to be calling to me, its presence pressing down on me, suffocating me. The figure tilted its head, and for the first time, I saw its mouth twist into a grin. It wasn't human. "Go ahead," it said, its voice like a rasping wind. "You know you want to." I stepped forward, my hand reaching for the door, and as I touched the cold metal, something in me snapped. Everything went black. I woke up, but it wasn't the same. The world had shifted again, and now I wasn't sure if it was the real world at all. My eyes opened to darkness, to a silence so deep that it felt suffocating. I was lying on the cold floor, my body stiff and aching, but as I sat up, I realized something even more unsettling. The air had changed. It wasn't the same hum I had heard before. Now, it was louder, sharper, vibrating in my skull, filling every corner of my mind. I tried to stand, but my legs trembled beneath me. I was disoriented, my senses failing me. The room I was in, it didn't feel like my apartment anymore. The walls were covered in cracks, as if the building itself were falling apart, but the most unsettling part was the light, or rather, the absence of it. There was no sun, no stars, just the suffocating darkness that pressed in from all sides. Then I saw it. The door. The same rusted door I had touched before. It was standing before me now, but it wasn't where it had been. It was right there, just a few feet away, as if it had always been waiting for me. I approached it slowly, my mind screaming at me to stop, to turn around and run. But the pull, those lights, that voice, they had taken control of me completely. I reached for the handle, and as my hand closed around it, I felt the shock again. The cold, the jolt, the undeniable connection between me and whatever lay beyond. I opened the door. What I saw on the other side wasn't the world I had known. It was like stepping into a void, a place where reality itself seemed to fray at the edges. The sky above was filled with those same lights, their glow blinding and endless. The ground beneath me was nothing but shadows, shifting and twisting, like I was standing on the edge of a dream or a nightmare. And then I heard it. The voice. The one that had called to me all along. "Come," it whispered. "Come to us. You belong here." I stepped forward, unable to resist. The world seemed to shift around me, the lights growing brighter, the shadows deeper. My body felt light, as if I was floating, and yet every step I took felt heavier, like I was being drawn deeper into something I could no longer escape. I looked around, but there was nothing here. No solid ground, no familiar landmarks. Only the endless void and the lights. They surrounded me now, each one pulsing, each one beckoning. And then I saw it, the figure. The one I had seen before. It was standing just in front of me, waiting, its empty eyes fixed on me. It didn't speak, but its presence filled the space around me, overwhelming and suffocating. I couldn't fight it anymore. The lights were inside me now, filling every part of my mind, twisting my thoughts, pulling me apart. I wasn't myself anymore. I was something else. Something that belonged here, in this place, with them. The figure reached out, its hand cold and lifeless. I wanted to resist, to scream, but I couldn't. I reached out in return, my fingers brushing against its skin. And in that moment, I knew. I wasn't just a victim of the lights. I was a part of them now. The lights flickered, and for a brief moment, everything went dark. And then, there was nothing. Have you ever wondered who lives in the spaces you can't see? The places you rarely think about, but feel their presence nonetheless? The attic above, the basement below, those dark, forgotten corners of your home that hold more than just dust and old furniture. It started with a sound. It was late, past midnight, when I first heard it. At first, it was faint, a whisper of a noise, like something scraping against wood. I paused, listening, but the sound stopped as quickly as it began. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just the house settling. After all, old houses make noises, don't they? But the noise didn't stop. It came again the next night, and the next. I tried to ignore it. But it wasn't just the sound. It was the feeling. That unsettling sensation, the one that creeps up your spine and makes you glance over your shoulder for no reason. The basement door, always locked and never used, seemed different. I couldn't put my finger on it. There was a strange weight in the air around it now, like something was stirring just beyond the threshold. I've lived in this apartment for years, and the basement was always off limits. I'd never needed to go down there. The landlord had told me it was just a storage space, nothing special. But as I stood in front of that door, my hand hovering over the cold metal doorknob, something inside me told me it wasn't just storage. It never had been. The first time I decided to open the door, I didn't expect to find anything. I was sure it was all just my imagination. After all, people don't just live in basements without anyone noticing, right? But when I turned the key, the door creaked open, and I immediately regretted it. The air was thick with a stale, musty odor, like something had been sealed away for far too long. The basement was dark, the only light coming from the narrow window at the top of the stairs. The shadows seemed to move in the corners, and my heart started to race as I stepped down into the cold, damp space. I called out. No response. But there was a strange feeling in the air, like I was being watched. The sound of my footsteps echoed in the silence, each one amplifying the dread that had settled deep in my chest. The basement was empty, except for the strange feeling. The walls, lined with shelves of forgotten things, felt too still. I walked to the far corner where a small window allowed just enough light to spill in. And that's when I noticed it. A chair. A worn-out chair in the middle of the floor, placed exactly where no chair should be. It was out of place. It was too deliberate. I backed away, my pulse quickening. I'd always thought the basement was empty and used. But that chair made me think otherwise. I didn't want to stay any longer. Something was wrong. Mike had told me to leave. But just before I turned to go, I heard something, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper from the farthest corner of the room. Why did you leave? I froze. The voice was familiar. Too familiar. It was my own voice. But it wasn't me. It wasn't coming from me. It was coming from the shadows. I rushed up the stairs and slammed the door behind me, locking it again. My heart was hammering in my chest, and I stood there for what felt like forever, staring at the door, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Who had been down there? That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, listening to the silence, trying to convince myself that it was all in my head. But then I heard it again. A faint scraping sound coming from the basement. The next day, I decided to investigate. I had to know who or what was down there. But when I opened the door again, everything felt different. The chair was gone. The chair was gone. I stood at the top of the basement stairs, staring into the darkness below. The silence was suffocating. There was no sound of scraping, no whispering voice. just the heavy, oppressive quiet that seemed to press against my ears. But I knew something had changed. I could feel it in the air. It was as if the basement itself had become alive, watching me, waiting for me to make the next move. I had to go down there again. The fear gnawed at me, but I couldn't stop. My curiosity, my need for answers, it was too strong. I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer and turned the key in the lock. The door creaked open with a sound that made my skin crawl. I descended the stairs slowly, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The basement looked the same, shelves full of old boxes, dusty furniture covered in sheets. Nothing seemed out of place except for that feeling. The sense that I wasn't alone. I walked over to where the chair had been, my steps hesitant, as if something might jump out at any moment. There was no sign of it. No evidence of anyone being down here, but the air felt heavier, thicker. I moved around the space, shining my flashlight over everything, but nothing seemed to stand out. That's when I saw it, the small, handwritten note tucked under one of the shelves. It was barely visible, hidden among the old papers and forgotten books. My heart skipped a beat as I bent down to pick it up. The note was simple, scrawled in hurried handwriting. I know what you did. You can't hide from me. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The words were sharp, accusing. But what did it mean? What did I do? I felt a chill crawl down my spine, and for a moment, I thought I saw something move in the shadows. My heart pounded in my chest, and I quickly stuffed the note into my pocket. I didn't want to be here anymore. Something was wrong. I needed to leave. But as I turned to go back to the stairs, I heard it, the softest sound, like a footstep. A faint scuff of a shoe on the floor. I spun around, my flashlight flicking wildly across the room. But there was nothing. Only the dark, empty corners of the basement. Then, a voice. You really think you can leave? The voice was a low whisper, almost like it was coming from inside my own head. It was familiar, but distorted, twisted. It was me, but it wasn't me. I took a step back, panic rising in my throat. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The basement felt smaller now, like the walls were closing in. The floor creaked underfoot, and the shadows shifted, as though they were reaching toward me. You don't have much time, the voice continued, growing louder. You can't escape what you've done. I ran for the stairs, but before I could reach them, the basement door slammed shut with a deafening bang. I stumbled, falling to the ground, my heart racing. The darkness was thick now, oppressive. The flashlight flickered, casting long, twisted shadows across the walls. And in the dim light, I saw it, a figure standing at the bottom of the stairs, just outside the beam of the flashlight. Its shape was distorted, like it was shifting between forms. Its face, my face, was twisted in a grotesque grin. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. Welcome home, it said in my voice. We've been waiting for you. And then, everything went dark. I don't remember how long I was in the dark. It felt like hours, days, even. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened, but everything was jumbled, distorted. I could still hear that voice, that twisted version of my own, echoing in my mind. Welcome home. It was all I could think about. When I finally regained some clarity, I was back in my apartment. My body ached, but the worst of it was the feeling of being watched. It was there again, like a presence lingering just outside my vision, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. I checked the basement door. It was locked. But it didn't feel like the same door. Something about it seemed different. The air around it felt colder now, as if it was drawing in all the warmth from the rest of the apartment. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to know what was happening. The figure, my voice, the whispers, it all felt like I was losing grip on reality. I needed answers. I gathered what little courage I had left and walked toward the door. My fingers trembled as I reached for the key, but before I could unlock it, I heard something. A tapping. Soft at first, like the knock of a distant hand. But as I listened, it became clearer. It was coming from the basement, rhythmic, deliberate. I froze, the key still in my hand. The sound wasn't like footsteps. It was something else, something methodical, like a countdown. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to face whatever was down there, whatever had been watching me. I opened the door. The basement was just as I remembered it, dark, cold, and unsettling. But this time, there was no whispering. No footsteps. Just an eerie silence. The light from the small window did little to illuminate the shadows, but it was enough for me to make my way down the stairs. I had to find out who, or what, had been living in my basement and how it knew everything about me. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I noticed something I hadn't before. The walls. They were covered in old photographs, some faded, others torn. They were pictures of me, some I recognized, some I didn't. There I was, standing on my front porch, my face twisted in confusion. Another picture showed me sitting at my desk, reading a book. It was as though someone had been following me for years, documenting my every move. I stumbled back, my head spinning. How could this be possible? Who had been taking these pictures? The air grew colder, and I heard it again. That tapping sound, now louder, more insistent. It was coming from deeper in the basement. I followed the noise, my breath coming faster, my heart pounding in my chest. I turned the corner and found the source. It was a wall, a blank wall, except for one thing, a small crack running down the center, just big enough for someone to hide behind. The tapping was coming from beyond it. I reached for the flashlight, shining it on the crack. My hands shook, but I couldn't stop now. I had to know what was on the other side. I pressed against the wall, and to my shock, it shifted. It wasn't solid. It was a door. I pushed harder, and the wall moved aside, revealing a small, hidden room behind it. My flashlight flickered as I stepped inside. The room was cramped, barely big enough to fit a small chair and a table. And on that table, there was a stack of notebooks, each one filled with writing. I picked one up, my hands trembling, and began to flip through it. The pages were filled with detailed notes about my life, every action, every conversation, every moment I had ever thought was private. The handwriting was familiar. It was mine. But I hadn't written any of this. I felt the blood drain from my face as I realized the truth. Someone had been living in my basement, watching me, listening to me, documenting my every move. And that someone wasn't a stranger. It was me. I turned to the table, trying to make sense of it all, but then I saw it. Another photograph. And this time, I knew it wasn't a trick. It was a picture of me, right now, standing in that very room, holding the notebook. I turned around, but there was no one there. The tapping resumed, louder now. And I knew, with a sickening certainty, that I wasn't alone anymore. I stood frozen in that small room, clutching the photograph of myself, a cold sweat trickling down my neck. The tapping had stopped for a moment, but now it returned, a steady rhythm that felt almost like a heartbeat. My thoughts were racing. Was this a trick? Some kind of elaborate game? Or had I really been living with another version of myself in the basement this whole time? The photograph in my hand trembled as I stared at it, my mind struggling to understand. How had this happened? How could I have been down here without even knowing it? The walls of the basement felt like they were closing in on me. The dim light from the flashlight seemed too small, the shadows too deep. I turned around, half expecting to see someone or something standing right behind me. But there was nothing. Just the empty room. Just me. I took a shaky step toward the door, my mind screaming at me to get out, to escape. But as I reached for the door, I heard the whisper again. You think you can leave? The voice was unmistakable. It was mine, but twisted. A distorted version of my own voice that sent a chill down my spine. I spun around, but no one was there. The room remained unchanged. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest as I stepped back into the room, my eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. The tapping continued, louder now. It was no longer coming from the crack in the wall. It was coming from somewhere behind me, from within the room itself. I froze, not daring to move. My body tensed, my pulse quickening as I turned toward the source of the sound. And that's when I saw it. There, in the far corner of the room, a figure was standing. It was me, or rather, a twisted version of myself. The figure was standing perfectly still, just watching me, its face expressionless, yet eerily familiar. Its eyes were hollow, dark pits that seemed to suck in the light from the room, making it feel colder. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The figure didn't move. It didn't speak. It just stood there, watching me with those hollow eyes. I knew then that I wasn't dealing with a person. This wasn't just another version of me. It was something else, something wrong, something unnatural. Who are you? I asked, my voice shaking. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it slowly raised one hand, pointing directly at me. The tapping sound grew louder, echoing through the room as if it was coming from every direction at once. My head spun, my vision blurred. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned to run. But before I could take a step, the basement door slammed shut with a deafening crash. I stumbled, falling to the ground, my body frozen in fear. I tried to scream, but my throat was tight, the words stuck in my chest. The figure in the corner took a step forward. And then another. Its eyes never left me as it moved, its slow, deliberate steps matching the rhythm of the tapping. You're not going anywhere, the voice whispered again, the words sending a wave of terror through me. I tried to move, to crawl toward the door, but my body felt like it was weighed down by something that didn't belong. My limbs felt heavy, like they were made of stone. I couldn't breathe. The figure was right behind me now. I could feel its presence, its cold breath on my neck, but when I turned, there was nothing there. The tapping stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. A deep, suffocating silence. And then, the voice spoke again. Are you ready to face the truth? I didn't understand what it meant. What truth? I glanced down at the notebook in my hand. The one I'd been holding for so long. The pages were filled with my thoughts, my actions, my every move. But as I flipped through it, I noticed something disturbing. There were new entries written in my handwriting, but not by me. The entries were about the figure in the corner, about its movements, its actions, its presence in the basement. They described everything that had happened, everything I had forgotten. You were never alone, the voice whispered. You never have been. The room seemed to spin around me. I couldn't breathe. The shadows closed in, the tapping returned, faster now, louder. And the figure, it was still there, just out of the corner of my eye, watching, waiting. The truth hit me all at once. I was never supposed to find out. The room felt like it was collapsing. The walls seemed to move in on me, pulling the space tighter and tighter until there was no escape. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, a frantic drumbeat that matched the tapping sound, which now reverberated through every inch of my body. The figure in the corner stood still, its eyes burning into me, as if it could see right through me. The notebook in my hands was now an anchor, a heavy weight that tied me to something far worse than just a basement. It was a reminder of everything I had tried to bury, everything I had forgotten. You weren't supposed to remember, the voice said, a low, mocking tone filling the air. But now you do. I wanted to scream, but my throat was dry, my body frozen in place. I was trapped. Trapped in the room with that thing that looked like me, felt like me, but wasn't me. You know what I am, the voice continued. You know who I am. And now you have to face it. The figure in the corner took another step forward, its hollow eyes gleaming with an eerie satisfaction. It felt as if the air itself had turned to ice. Every inch of me screamed to run, but my legs wouldn't move. It was as though the room itself had chained me to the spot, holding me hostage in its dark embrace. The tapping stopped. The silence was so thick it pressed against my eardrums. I could hear my own breath, shallow and frantic, but everything else, everything, was still. Then, without warning, the room shifted. The shelves on the walls groaned, shifting out of place, and I realized that the room wasn't just a basement. It wasn't just a room hidden behind a secret door. It was a reflection of me, of my mind, of everything I had ever been. The notebooks, they were just pieces of a puzzle I hadn't wanted to solve. The photographs, the scribbled notes, they were all fragments of my fractured self, scattered around the space like clues I was never meant to find. I finally understood. I wasn't being haunted by another version of myself. I was being haunted by the part of me that I had locked away, the part of me that I didn't want to face. The tapping wasn't from the figure. It was from me, the part of me that had been in the basement all along, lurking in the darkness, waiting for the right moment to step into the light. I staggered back, the notebook falling from my hands as the room around me seemed to pulse. The shadows in the corners of the basement were no longer just shadows. They were alive, shifting and writhing, growing into shapes that twisted and contorted like phantoms. And then I heard it. A voice, not mine this time, but something deeper, darker. You can't hide from yourself. The floor beneath me began to crack, the sound echoing like thunder. The room was splitting apart, and I felt the weight of the darkness pressing down on me. The walls, the ceiling, everything was crumbling. I tried to scream, but my voice was swallowed by the roar of the collapse. And in that moment, I realized it wasn't the room that was falling apart, it was me. I had been broken long ago, and now the cracks were showing. The pieces of myself I had hidden away for so long were coming to the surface. I fell to my knees, my body shaking uncontrollably as the darkness closed in. The last thing I saw before the shadows overtook me was that figure, myself, standing over me, its face twisted in a grotesque grin. "Welcome back," it whispered. And then, nothing. The basement door opened with a creak. The sunlight streamed into the room, warm and welcoming, yet for some reason it felt distant, like it was too far away to reach. The floor was covered in dust and debris, the remnants of the collapsed walls scattered across the ground. But there was no sign of the figure. No trace of the darkness that had been there just moments ago. I stood at the edge of the doorway, my body trembling, but there was something else now. A sense of finality. A sense that it was over. But the truth was, it would never be over. The basement had never just been a room beneath my house. It had been the space inside my mind. The part of me I had feared to confront. And now, as I stepped out into the light, I realized that I couldn't escape what I had become. The basement wasn't a place. It was me. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.